Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. On an autumn morning, when the golden leaves danced gently in the wind, Cinderella woke up before the first ray of sunlight had even touched the windows of the Tremaine mansion. Her blue eyes, although tired, still held that special sparkle that not even years of hard work could erase. His blonde hair, tied back in a simple ponytail, framed a face that, despite its youth, already knew the weight of responsibility all too well. The mansion, once a place of joy and love when her parents were still alive, was now like a gilded prison. The long, ornate corridors, which had once echoed with laughter and music, now only conveyed the sound of her stepmother Lady Tremaine's impatient heels and her stepsisters Anastasia and Drizella's off-key screams. Cinderella clearly remembered the day her father brought Lady Tremaine and her daughters to live with them. At the time, only 8 years old, she believed she would finally have the family she had dreamed of since her mother's death. Her father, a prosperous merchant, was overjoyed at the idea of giving his beloved daughter a new mother. But fate had other plans, and less than a year later, he left on a business trip from which he never returned. It was then that Lady Tremaine's true nature revealed itself. In a matter of days, Cinderella was removed from her luxurious bedroom on the second floor and relegated to the cold, dusty attic. Her beautiful dresses were replaced by rags, and her jewels, inherited from her mother, mysteriously disappeared. From a beloved daughter, she became a servant in her own home. Now, 10 years later, at the age of 18, Cinderella had developed a meticulous routine to survive the endless days of work. She began her journey by feeding the chickens in the backyard, where at least she could talk to her only real friends, the little mice Jack and Gus, as well as various birds who always appeared to keep her company. "Good morning, my little friends," she whispered as she scattered corn around the chicken coop. Jack, the smartest and skinniest mouse, always replied with a cheerful "Good morning, Cinderella," in his squeaky voice, while Gus, the chubbiest and greediest mouse, was already busy trying to steal some grain for himself. The sun had barely risen when the cries began. "Cinderella, my breakfast?" It was Anastasia, her voice shrill. "Cinderella, where are my clean clothes?" This time it was Drizella, no less annoying. And finally, Lady Tremaine's cold, calculated command. "Cinderella, come at once." With agile and silent steps, learned after years of practice, she went up and down the stairs of the mansion, balancing trays, carrying clean clothes, and answering the impossible commands of her half-sisters. Anastasia, with her red hair and pointed face, demanded that her coffee was just the right temperature. Drizella, brunette and always grumpy, complained about the way her ribbons had been ironed. Lady Tremaine watched everything with her feline eyes, sitting in her favorite armchair, stroking her fat, evil cat Lucifer. The animal, black as night, seemed to share his owner's cruelty, always chasing Cinderella's little friends and creating situations in which she would be reprimanded. Even in the midst of such contempt, Cinderella kept the memory of happy days alive in her heart. Sometimes, when she had finished her chores late at night, she would go up to the attic and sit by the round window, watching the royal castle shining in the distance. In his chest, a small flame of hope never went out, fueled by the stories his father used to tell him about love, courage, and magic. It was during one of these nights of contemplation that a royal herald passed through the streets of the kingdom, announcing news that would change everyone's destiny forever. The king had decided to hold a grand ball, where his son, Prince Christopher, would choose his future wife. All the young women in the kingdom were invited, regardless of their social standing. The news spread like wildfire through the Tremaine mansion. Anastasia and Drizella went into a frenzy of preparations, while Lady Tremaine saw this as the perfect opportunity to ensure that one of her daughters would become the future queen. Cinderella, hiding behind a curtain as she dusted the furniture, felt her heart race at the prospect of attending a festival for the first time in years. Gathering up all her courage, she approached Lady Tremaine that very evening. "Stepmother, the invitation goes out to all the young ladies of the kingdom. I too am a young lady of the realm." Lady Tremaine, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, replied with false sweetness, "Yes, dear, you're right. If you can finish all your chores and find something suitable to wear, I don't see why you can't go." Cinderella could hardly believe her ears. She ran up to the attic, where she kept her most precious treasure, a dress that had belonged to her mother. It was a little old-fashioned and would need a few adjustments, but with the help of her little friends, who were already offering to search the house for ribbons and buttons, she knew she could turn it into something special. What Cinderella didn't know was that that night would only mark the beginning of an extraordinary journey, where magic, love, and courage would intertwine to change not only her destiny, but that of the entire kingdom. On the horizon, a fairy godmother was already watching intently, waiting for the right moment to enter the scene and help that special young girl find her true path to happiness. In the days following the announcement of the royal ball, the Tremaine mansion turned into chaos. Anastasia and Drizella ran around, demanding that Cinderella alter dresses, adjust bows, and create ever more elaborate hairstyles. Their attempts to look elegant often resulted in comic disasters that only Cinderella could discreetly solve. During the evenings, after finishing her daily chores, Cinderella worked tirelessly on her own dress. Jack and Gus, along with other mice, had managed to find lost pearls under the furniture, forgotten ribbons in drawers, and even a beautiful pink fabric that Drizella had discarded after one of her usual fits of rage. "Cinderella, look what we've found," exclaimed Jack one evening, dragging along a blue satin bow that would perfectly complement the dress. Cinderella couldn't hold back her tears of gratitude when she saw the efforts of her little friends. Lady Tremaine, noticing Cinderella's discreet enthusiasm, deliberately increased her daily chores. "Oh dear," she said with false concern, "the curtains in the music room need to be washed again. And don't forget to polish all the silverware. The floor of the main hall is also in need of a good scrubbing." Even so, Cinderella was not discouraged. As she mopped the floor, she hummed softly, imagining herself dancing in the castle ballroom. Her movements with the mop turned into waltz steps, and for a few magical moments, she allowed herself to dream of a different life. One day, while cleaning the attic, Cinderella found an old book of fairy tales that had belonged to her mother. The yellowed pages contained stories about princesses, fairy godmothers, and happy endings. One illustration in particular caught her eye, a young girl in a beautiful ball gown, dancing with a prince. Something in that image lit an even bigger flame of hope in her heart. "You know, Jack," she confided to the little mouse while sewing by candlelight, "sometimes I think my mother is watching me from somewhere, hoping I don't lose faith. She always said that kindness is the greatest magic there is." The days passed quickly and the ball was approaching. The whole town was abuzz with preparations. Merchants displayed their finest silks and jewels. Shoemakers worked day and night to fulfill orders, and young dreamers bowed in front of mirrors, imagining the moment when they would meet the prince. At the castle, Prince Christopher himself was less than enthusiastic about the idea of the ball. "Father," he argued with the king, "don't you think there's a less theatrical way of finding a wife?" The king, a short, pudgy man with a passion for sweets and traditions, just laughed at his son's concerns. "Nonsense. A royal ball is exactly what this kingdom needs. Besides," he added with a mischievous grin, "I'm too old to wait any longer for my grandchildren." At the Tremaine mansion, the eve of the big day arrived with unprecedented excitement. Anastasia had decided that her green dress needed more frills, while Drizella insisted that her jewelry wasn't extravagant enough. Lady Tremaine watched everything with a satisfied smile, already planning how one of her daughters could capture the prince's attention. Cinderella, for her part, had finally finished her dress. It wasn't as luxurious as her stepsister's, but there was something special about it. Every stitch had been made with love, every detail chosen with care. The result was a simple but elegant dress that highlighted her natural beauty. "It's perfect, Cinderella," exclaimed Gus, spinning around happily while the other mice applauded. Even the birds that used to visit her window seemed to approve, trilling a cheerful tune. That night, while helping her stepsisters with the final preparations for the ball, Cinderella allowed herself to dream about what would happen the next day. She imagined herself walking down the steps of the mansion in her refurbished dress, getting into the carriage with her family, and finally, after so many years, having a night of merriment and dancing. What she didn't know was that fate sometimes has more extraordinary plans than our wildest dreams can imagine, and that, somewhere not too far away, a fairy godmother was already preparing her magic wand, knowing that the moment to transform the life of that special young girl was closer than ever. As night fell over the city, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, as if they too were looking forward to what was to come. In the Tremaine mansion, Cinderella fell asleep with a smile on her lips, her heart full of hope for the day that was about to dawn. The big day finally arrived, bringing with it unprecedented excitement to the Tremaine mansion. The sun had barely risen when Cinderella was already on her feet, rushing around to help her stepsisters with the final preparations. Anastasia demanded that her curls be perfectly styled, while Drizella kept complaining that her dress needed more adjustments. "Cinderella, where's my pearl necklace?" cried Anastasia from the top of the stairs. "Cinderella, my shoes are tight," cried Drizella from her bedroom. The young girl rushed to answer all the calls, keeping a serene smile on her face, because she knew that in a few hours it would be her turn to get ready for the ball. In between tasks, Cinderella discreetly went up to the attic to admire her refurbished dress, now hanging behind a screen. Jack and Gus stood guard proudly beside the dress, like little sentries protecting a precious treasure. "You're going to be the prettiest at the ball, Cinderella," said Jack with conviction, while Gus nodded enthusiastically, his cheeks streaked with crumbs from the breakfast Cinderella had shared with them. As the afternoon progressed, the anxiety in the mansion reached its peak. Lady Tremaine oversaw every detail of her daughter's preparations with an eagle eye, ensuring that nothing was out of place. Her plans to arrange a royal wedding for one of her daughters could not be ruined by any slip-up. Finally, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Cinderella finished her chores and ran up to the attic to get ready. With the help of her little friends, she took a quick bath and began to dress. Her blonde hair was tied up in an elegant bun, with a few loose strands framing her face. The dress, although simple compared to those of her half-sisters, fit her slender body perfectly. The blue ribbons and satin bow that the mice had found added a special touch to the outfit. Cinderella turned in front of the small broken mirror, feeling truly beautiful for the first time in many years. "I'm ready," she announced, gracefully descending the stairs. Lady Tremaine and her daughters, already fully dressed, were waiting in the drawing room. The moment her eyes landed on Cinderella was one of pure shock. But, that's my lace," squealed Drizella, pointing to the blue satin on Cinderella's dress. "And those are my old pearls," exclaimed Anastasia, recognizing the tiny details on the bodice. Lady Tremaine watched the scene with a dangerous glint in her eyes. "So," she said in a soft voice that barely disguised her fury, "you stole my daughter's belongings to make your dress?" "No, stepmother," protested Cinderella. "I found these discarded things. They were just leftovers that..." But before she could finish her explanation, Anastasia and Drizella advanced on her like beasts. "Thief!" they shouted, pulling at the ribbons, tearing at the fabric, destroying the work of weeks and seconds. Cinderella watched in horror as her dream fell to pieces before her eyes. Lady Tremaine did nothing to stop her daughters. When they were finally satisfied with the destruction, she just said coldly, "Well, it looks like you don't have anything suitable to wear to the ball anymore. Too bad. Come on, girls, the carriage is waiting for us." With a cruel smile, she led Anastasia and Drizella out of the mansion, leaving Cinderella alone amidst the wreckage of her dress and her dreams. The tears she had held back for so long finally began to fall. Running to the back garden, Cinderella threw herself onto a stone bench, sobbing uncontrollably. Her little friends followed her, trying to offer consolation, but for the first time, their presence wasn't enough to ease her pain. "I was foolish to think I could go to the ball," she whispered through her tears. "I was foolish to believe that something magical could happen to me. It was at that moment that something extraordinary began to happen. Tiny lights, like golden fireflies, began to dance around the garden. The air seemed to become lighter, more sparkling, and a sweet, motherly voice sounded close to Cinderella. "Don't cry, dear. All magic begins with a tear of hope." Cinderella raised her watery eyes and was stunned by what she saw. Before her stood a kindly-looking lady, dressed in a shimmering blue cloak and holding a wand that glowed softly in the night. Her smile was so warm and comforting that Cinderella felt her heart calm instantly. "Oh, who are you?" she asked, still not believing her eyes. "Why, my dear," replied the lady with an even wider smile, "I'm your fairy godmother, of course, and the time has come to turn your tears into something truly magical." The fairy godmother raised her glittering wand and, with one smooth movement, began to chant the magic words, "Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo." The whole garden filled with golden light, and tiny magical sparks danced in the night air. Cinderella watched in amazement as her fairy godmother began to work her magic. "First," said the fairy with a playful smile, "we need a carriage fit for a princess." Her eyes roamed the garden until they found a large pumpkin. With another wave of her wand, the pumpkin began to grow and transform. Its sides expanded, gaining elegant curves and golden details, until it became a magnificent carriage that sparkled like crystal in the moonlight. "Now we need horses," continued the fairy, with a few more graceful flicks of her wand, for Cinderella's mouse friends, including Jack and Gus, were transformed into majestic white horses. Their hair shimmered like silk, and their manes fluttered in the wind like satin ribbons. "But who will drive?" asked Cinderella, still absorbed in the magical spectacle unfolding before her eyes. The fairy godmother laughed softly and, with another wave, transformed an old garden lizard into an elegant coachman, dressed in an impeccable uniform. "And we mustn't forget the minions," she exclaimed, transforming 2 friendly mice into garrulous minions, who immediately took up their positions beside the carriage. Finally, the fairy godmother turned her attention to Cinderella. "And now, my dear, we're going to take care of you." With a flick of her wand, magical sparks enveloped Cinderella in a swirl of light. Her torn rags began to transform, the simple fabric giving way to a delicate silk that seemed woven with moonlight. The dress that emerged was a sky blue so pure that it seemed to capture the sky itself. The swirling skirt floated as if it were made of clouds, and tiny crystals sparkled across the length of the fabric like stars. Her hair was magically arranged in an elegant hairstyle, adorned with tiny crystal flowers that sparkled with every movement. But the final touch, and perhaps the most magical of all, were the little shoes. Made entirely of crystal, they reflected the light like diamonds and fitted Cinderella's feet perfectly, as if they had been sculpted especially for her. "They're perfect," exclaimed Cinderella, turning to admire her reflection in a nearby pool of water. She could hardly recognize the elegant and graceful young woman she saw reflected. "Remember, my dear," warned the fairy godmother in a more serious tone, "all magic has its price. The enchantment will only last until the last stroke of midnight. When the clock strikes 12, everything will go back to the way it was before." Cinderella nodded, firmly engraving the warning in her mind. "I understand, fairy godmother. I'll be back before midnight, I promise." With the help of her minions, she climbed into the carriage, her heart beating fast with anticipation. Through the window, she saw her fairy godmother waving with a motherly smile. "Go, my dear, and remember, be true to yourself, for it is your goodness that makes you truly special." The carriage drove off gently into the night, and Cinderella felt as if she were living in a dream. The city streets looked different from inside that magical carriage, and every time they passed, people stopped to admire the extraordinary spectacle. At the castle, the ball was already in full swing. The main hall glowed with thousands of candles, and the orchestra played soft waltzes while dozens of couples danced gracefully across the marble hall. Prince Christopher, meanwhile, looked bored as he was introduced to an endless succession of young noble women. Lady Tremaine watched from a corner of the ballroom, proud to see Anastasia and Drizella trying to catch the prince's eye with their exaggerated movements and boisterous laughter. Other guests whispered and laughed discreetly at the sisters' clumsy attempts. It was at that moment that a murmur of admiration went through the hall. All eyes turned to the entrance, where an ethereal figure had just appeared. Cinderella, in her magical dress, was slowly descending the grand staircase, her little crystal shoes tinkling softly against the marble steps. Prince Christopher himself, who until then had shown complete disinterest in the ball, was immediately mesmerized by the sight. Without hesitation, he crossed the hall towards the mysterious newcomer, ignoring his father's whispered protests and Lady Tremain's furious glances. "Excuse me," he said, bowing before Cinderella. "Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Cinderella, her heart pounding, bowed gracefully and accepted the prince's outstretched hand. The orchestra began a new waltz, and soon the two were dancing, lost in their own magical world. Their movements were so perfect and natural that it seemed as if they had been born to dance together. "I've never seen you before," commented the prince as they twirled around the ballroom. "I'm sure I'd remember." Cinderella smiled mysteriously, feeling more confident than she had ever been. "Perhaps some people aren't exactly as they seem at first glance, Your Highness." The prince laughed, charmed by her enigmatic response. "Please call me Christopher. And you are—" But before Cinderella could answer, the first chime of midnight echoed through the hall. Her heart froze as she realized that she was so engrossed in the dance that she had completely lost track of time. "Oh no," whispered Cinderella, her heart racing with every chime of the clock. "Forgive me, but I must go," she said to the prince, letting go of his arms and running toward the staircase. "Wait," called Christopher, trying to catch up with her. "I don't even know your name." Cinderella ran as fast as she could, her little crystal shoes echoing against the marble. In her haste, she didn't notice when one of them slipped off her foot on the way down the stairs. The prince, seeing the slippers shining in the candlelight, stopped to pick it up, losing precious seconds in the chase. The young woman reached her magical carriage just in time for the sixth chime. The horses, sensing the urgency of the moment, galloped swiftly through the city streets. With each new chime, Cinderella could feel the magic beginning to unravel. At the ninth stroke, the coachman and his minions began to tremble, their elegant forms oscillating between human and animal. On the 10th, the carriage began to lose its crystalline shine, orange spots appearing on its sides. With the 11th chime, Cinderella jumped out of the carriage, which was already beginning to shrink, and ran through the mansion garden. At the exact moment the 12th chime sounded, she was safe in her attic, wearing her rags again, but still with a crystal slipper on her foot, the only tangible proof that that magical night had not been just a dream. In the castle, Prince Christopher held the other slipper, determined to find his mysterious dancer. "Father," he declared to the king, who was watching the scene with a mixture of concern and amusement, "I will find the owner of this shoe even if I have to visit every house in the kingdom." The next morning, a royal decree was announced. The Grand Duke would visit every home in the kingdom, taking the little crystal shoe with him. The young woman whose foot fit the shoe perfectly would be recognized as the mysterious lady of the ball, and, if she so wished, could marry the prince. When Lady Tremaine heard the news, she locked Cinderella in the attic. "We can't risk this chance going to waste," she muttered to herself, keeping the key in her pocket. While Anastasia and Drizella frantically prepared for the Grand Duke's arrival, Jack and Gus, who had witnessed everything, worked tirelessly to steal the key from Lady Tremaine's pocket. It was a dangerous mission, especially with Lucifer always nearby, but they knew it was Cinderella's only chance. The Grand Duke arrived at the Tremaine mansion at precisely 3 in the afternoon. Anastasia was the first to try to put the shoe on, wriggling her toes and straining her foot in every possible way. Drizella was no more successful, going so far as to almost break the precious crystal in her desperate attempt. In the attic, Cinderella could hear all the commotion. Her heart was racing as Jack and Gus finally managed to hand her the key, after an exciting adventure that involved distracting Lucifer with an ingenious trap. "Are there any other young ladies in this house?" asked the Grand Duke, preparing to leave. "Me," called out Cinderella, descending the stairs with grace, even in her simple attire. "I'd like to try on a shoe, if I may." Lady Tremaine tried to interfere, "But she's only a maid." But the royal decree was clear. Every young girl should have her chance. Cinderella sat down in the chair, and before the Grand Duke could even approach the shoe, she pulled out her identical pair from her pocket. The hall filled with exclamations of surprise when she put on both shoes, which fitted perfectly. At that moment, her fairy godmother appeared in a swirl of magical light. With a wave of her wand, she transformed Cinderella's simple clothes into the same dazzling dress from the night of the ball. "That's her," exclaimed the Grand Duke. "The mysterious lady of the ball." Prince Christopher, who had insisted on personally accompanying some of the visitors, rushed into the mansion when he heard the commotion. His eyes met Cinderella's, and all the love they had shared during that magical dance returned in full force. "I knew I'd find you," he said, taking her hands in his. "But now I need to know, what is your name?" "Cinderella," she replied softly, "and my whole life has been a preparation for this moment." The wedding was celebrated a few weeks later, with all the pomp and circumstance that a royal event deserved. Cinderella, radiant in her wedding dress, made sure that her little friends took places of honor at the ceremony. Jack and Gus, wearing tiny formal clothes, couldn't have been prouder. Lady Tremaine and her daughters were invited to move to a remote estate where they lived to reflect on their past actions. The Tremaine mansion was transformed into an orphanage where destitute children found not only shelter but also love and hope. As a final magical surprise, the fairy godmother presented the couple with a pair of crystal slippers for their first daughter, ensuring that the magic and love would live on for generations. And so Cinderella discovered that her mother was right. Kindness really is the greatest magic there is. Her gentle heart and resilient spirit had been her true strength during all those difficult years. And now they were the basis of her happiness alongside the prince who had won her heart. Did they live happily ever after? Well, real life has its ups and downs, but Cinderella and Christopher faced every challenge together with love, understanding, and that hint of magic that exists in every heart that remains open to dreaming. And on clear nights with a full moon, it is said that a magical carriage can still be seen crossing the kingdom's skies, reminding everyone that fairy tales can indeed come true. You just have to believe and keep kindness in your heart. In the crystalline depths of the ocean, where the sunlight danced in shades of blue and emerald across the waters, there was a majestic kingdom ruled by the mighty King Triton. His long silver hair waved with the sea currents, and his golden trident shone with the same intensity as his wise eyes. Among her 7 daughters, Marina, the youngest, was considered the most beautiful and mysterious of all. Marina had a voice that made the corals vibrate, and the fish stopped to listen. Her red hair floated like submerged flames, and her green eyes carried a curious gleam that reflected her restless soul. Unlike her sisters, who were content with the wonders of the underwater world, Marina dreamed of something more, something beyond the surface that intrigued her so much. In the palace of coral and pearls, Marina spent hours contemplating her secret treasure, a small cave full of objects recovered from shipwrecks, porcelain plates, silverware, watches that had stood the test of time, and books with pages stained by salt water made up her private collection. Her best friend, Sebastian, a cautious red crab, always accompanied her on her explorations, even though he constantly tried to dissuade her from her fascination with the human world. "Princess Marina, you know your father wouldn't approve of this," Sebastian would say, walking sideways over a coral shelf. "The world above is dangerous for us sea creatures." But Marina just smiled, twirling a fork between her delicate fingers. "How can something that creates such interesting objects be dangerous, Sebastio? Look at that. Humans call it a fork and use it to eat. Isn't it fascinating?" The young mermaid knew that her 15th birthday was just around the corner, the age at which mermaids were allowed to surface for the first time. Her older sisters had already made the journey, and each had come back with stories that fed her curiosity even more. Stories about birds flying against the blue sky, about ships cutting through the waves like wooden giants, and about humans dancing under the stars. On a particularly stormy night, When the sea currents were stronger than usual, Marina noticed an unusual movement in the waters above. A majestic ship was cutting through the waves, and colored lights were exploding in the dark sky. Unable to contain her curiosity, she swam to the surface, ignoring Sebastio's desperate protests. As she surfaced, her heart raced at the most breathtaking sight she had ever seen. The ship was even bigger than she had imagined, decorated with colorful flags that danced in the wind. Music and laughter echoed through the air, and Marina approached silently, hiding behind one of the ship's large wheels. It was then that she saw him for the first time. A young prince with black hair and a gentle smile was dancing on deck, surrounded by sailors and courtiers. His name was Eric, as Marina discovered from listening to the conversations above. There was something in his blue eyes that captivated her instantly, a kindness and vivacity that made her completely forget the world around her. But the happiness of that moment was brutally interrupted when dark clouds covered the stars and lightning cut through the sky. In a matter of minutes, a violent storm formed, turning the sea into a furious monster that shook the ship as if it were a toy. Marina watched in horror as the giant waves battered the ship. The sailors fought bravely against the fury of the sea, but it was a losing battle. Lightning struck the main mast, and flames began to devour the ship. In the midst of the chaos, Marina saw Prince Eric trying to help his crew, but a particularly strong wave threw him overboard. Without hesitation, she dived in after him. The waters were murky and choppy, but her mermaid eyes could see clearly through the darkness. She found the prince unconscious and sinking fast. With all her strength, she swam to him and wrapped her arms around him, fighting against the currents to bring him to the surface. The coast was not far away, but every moment was precious. Marina swam with determination, keeping the prince's face above water, singing softly to him an ancient melody of her people. When she finally reached the shore, the sky was beginning to lighten and the storm was diminishing in strength. She laid the prince gently on the sand, watching his pale face with concern. He was still breathing, but unconscious. Marina stroked his face with trembling fingers, feeling something awaken in her heart that she had never felt before. "Please live," she whispered, her melodious voice laden with emotion. "You have to live." The sound of approaching voices forced her back to the sea, but her eyes remained fixed on the figure of the prince until a young woman found him on the beach. Marina dived into the deep waters with a heart heavy with love and worry, knowing that her life would never be the same again. Back at the underwater palace, she ignored Sebastian's sermons about the dangers she had been in. Her thoughts were fixed on Prince Eric, his gentle smile, and the moments she held him in her arms. It was then that she made a decision that would change her destiny forever. She would find a way to be part of his world, no matter what the price. In the darkness of her coral room, Marina began to map out her plan, still unaware of the high price that fate would charge for her dream of love. In the shadows of the ocean depths, the sea witch watched through her magical eyes, smiling mischievously as she waited for the young mermaid to take the first step towards her transformative destiny. In the days that followed Prince Eric's rescue, Marina became more distant and dreamy than ever. She would spend hours near the surface, hiding behind rocks near the beach where she had left him, hoping to catch a glimpse of him walking along the sand. Her sisters noticed the change in her behavior, and concern began to spread throughout the underwater palace. "Marina is different," commented Pearl, the eldest of her sisters, during a family dinner. "She hardly touches her food and spends her days sighing in the corners." King Triton watched his youngest daughter with growing concern. He knew that distant look well, the same one their mother had when she fell in love with him years ago. However, love between a mermaid and a human was something forbidden, too dangerous to even consider. One afternoon, while watching the prince from her usual position, Marina was surprised by Flounder, a little yellow fish who was her childhood friend. "Marina, you can't go on like this," he said worriedly. "You're hurting yourself more and more." "I can't help it, Flounder," she replied, her green eyes fixed on Eric's distant figure. "Every time I see him, my heart seems to want to jump out of my chest. I need to find a way to be part of his world." It was then that Marina began to hear stories about Ursula, the sea witch. Whispers among the ocean currents spoke of her power to make impossible wishes come true for a price. Living in a cave in the darkest parts of the ocean, Ursula was feared by everyone, including King Triton himself. Sebastian, sensing Marina's thoughts, tried to intervene. "Princess, please get these thoughts out of your head. Ursula is dangerous. She destroys lives." But Marina had already made up her mind. One moonless night, while the palace slept, she quietly slipped out of her room. Sebastian and Flounder, who were watching her, tried to stop her, but her determination was greater than any warning. The path to Ursula's cave was dark and frightening. Deformed sea creatures, former victims of the witch, writhed on the seabed, their eyes glowing with silent warnings. Marina swam through them, her heart beating hard against her chest. The entrance to the cave looked like the mouth of a sea monster, with rock formations resembling pointed teeth. Two eels, Flotsam and Jetsam, glided around them, their yellow eyes twinkling mischievously. "Welcome, little princess," their voices echoed in unison. "The lady has been waiting for you." Inside the cave, Ursula emerged from the shadows. Half woman, half octopus, she had a sinister beauty that mesmerized. Her white hair floated like tentacles around her face, and a calculating smile played on her purple lips. "I know exactly why you're here, dear," said Ursula, her honeyed voice echoing off the cave walls. "You want to join your beloved prince in the surface world." Marina nodded, trying to hide her fear. "Yes, that's what I want more than anything." "Well, that could be arranged," replied Ursula, swimming over to a large cauldron. "I can turn your tail into human legs, but the price will be high. You'll have to give me your voice." "My voice?" Marina asked, putting her hand to her throat. "Exactly. And there are more conditions," the witch continued, her tentacles moving sinuously. "Every step you take will be like stepping on sharp needles. You'll have 3 days to make the prince fall in love with you and give you a kiss of true love. If you fail, at sunrise on the 4th day, you'll turn into sea foam." Marina hesitated for a moment, thinking about the consequences. How could she make Eric fall in love with her without her voice? How could she bear the pain at every step? But the image of the prince, his gentle smile and kind eyes, strengthened her resolve. "I accept," she said firmly. Ursula smiled, revealing pointed teeth. With a gesture, she made a golden contract appear. "Then sign here, dear." Marina took the offered quill and, with trembling hands, signed her name. Immediately, a magical whirlwind enveloped her. Ursula began to sing an ancient and sinister song, her hands weaving complex spells in the air. A golden light came out of Marina's throat, her voice materializing in the shape of a small, glowing sphere. Ursula captured it in a shell necklace that she hung around her own neck. At the same moment, a sharp pain shot through Marina's body, her tail splitting into 2 human legs. Unable to breathe underwater with her new human lungs, Marina began to struggle desperately. Flounder and Sebastio, who had followed their friend there, rushed to help her, bringing her quickly to the surface. When they emerged, the sun was rising over the horizon, painting the sky pink and gold. Marina was taken to the same beach where she had saved Eric, her body trembling at the new sensation of the waves against her human skin. Every movement was torture, as Ursula had warned, but in her heart a burning hope burned. Lying on the sand, watching the sun rise, Marina knew that her real journey had only just begun. 3 days to win Eric's love, 3 days to fulfill her dream, or face a tragic fate. The clock was ticking, and with it the biggest challenge of her life. The sun was already up when Marina heard voices approaching from the beach. Sebastian and Flounder quickly dived into the waves, leaving her alone on the sand. With difficulty, she sat up, using pieces of a torn sail she found on the beach to cover her body. Every movement was an indescribable torture, as if thousands of needles were piercing her newly formed feet. It was then that she recognized him. Eric was walking along the beach accompanied by his faithful dog Max and Grimsby, his royal advisor. Marina's heart raced when their gazes met. Eric ran towards her, genuinely worried about the mysterious young woman he had met. "Are you all right? What happened?" he asked, taking off his coat and putting it over her shoulders. Marina tried to answer, but no sound came from her throat. She put her hand to her throat, remembering the price she had paid. "She seems to have been shipwrecked, Your Highness," observed Grimsby, "and she's apparently lost her voice." Eric helped Marina to her feet, supporting her as her legs shook with the stabbing pain. "Let's get you to the palace. You need medical attention and proper clothing." At the castle, Marina was met by Carlotta, the housekeeper, who helped her with a hot bath and dressed her in a beautiful blue dress. While her skilled hands combed Marina's long red hair, Carlotta chattered happily about the prince and his search for the mysterious young woman who had saved him during the storm. "He talks of nothing but this girl with the most beautiful voice he's ever heard," Carlotta commented, not noticing how Marina paled at her words. "He's determined to find her and make her his wife." During dinner that night, Marina made an effort to behave like a lady of the surface, carefully observing how the others used the cutlery, the forks that fascinated her so much in her underwater collection. Eric couldn't take his eyes off her, enchanted by her natural grace and genuine curiosity about everything around her. "You remind me of someone," he said, studying her face. "Your eyes have something familiar about them." Marina smiled, wishing desperately that she could tell him the truth, that she was the one who had saved him. Over the next few days, Eric dedicated himself to showing Marina his kingdom. Despite the constant pain in her feet, she accompanied him at all times, amazed at each new discovery of the human world. They took carriage rides through the city, danced in the market to the sound of street musicians, even if every step was agony, and shared quiet moments in the palace gardens. Sebastian and Flounder watched them discreetly from the shore, hoping that Marina would manage to win the prince's love before it was too late. The crab even organized a choir of sea creatures to create a romantic atmosphere during a boat trip, but his efforts were interrupted by noisy seagulls. On a particularly beautiful afternoon, Eric took Marina for a boat trip on the lagoon. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Marina of her home in the deep. Eric rowed gently, his eyes fixed on her. "You know," he began, "since you came along, something has changed in me. It's as if like I've been waiting for you without knowing it." Marina felt her heart race at these words. Eric leaned towards her, their faces ever closer. But before their lips could touch, the boat rocked violently, almost capsizing. Two familiar figures slid into the dark waters, Flotsam and Jetsam, Ursula's eels, who had been sent to make sure Marina failed in her mission. The moment was broken, and Eric quickly rowed back to the shore, concerned for Marina's safety. As they walked back to the castle, he held her hand affectionately, but something in his gaze had changed, a shadow of doubt or worry that hadn't been there before. That night, alone in her room, Marina watched the stars through the window, thinking of her family in the depths of the ocean. King Triton had noticed their disappearance and ordered searches throughout the underwater kingdom. Her sisters swam tirelessly, calling out to her, their worried voices echoing through the waters. From his lookout post on the beach, Sebastian watched the castle with apprehension. Time was running out fast. Marina had just one more day to get the kiss of true love. Ursula's words echoed in his mind like a dark omen. "If you fail, at sunrise on the 4th day, you will turn into sea foam." In the darkness of her cave, Ursula watched everything through a crystal bowl, a mischievous smile on her purple lips. "Soon, very soon," she murmured, stroking the necklace that held Marina's voice. "Triton's daughter will be mine, and then the kingdom of the sea itself will fall into my hands." Marina's fate hung by a thread, balanced between Eric's growing love and the relentless time that was running against her. The stars shone in the night sky as silent witnesses to her dilemma, while the sea whispered ancient melodies of love and loss in the dark depths. The next morning, a commotion swept through the castle. A mysterious young woman had arrived on the beach, her melodious voice echoing through the halls of the palace. Eric, upon hearing that familiar song, ran towards her as if bewitched. Marina watched from her bedroom window, her heart clenching as she recognized her own voice coming from the stranger's lips. It was Vanessa, actually Ursula in disguise, wearing the necklace that contained Marina's stolen voice. Her long black hair and violet dress contrasted with her pale skin, and her eyes sparkled with a malice that only Marina seemed to notice. "It's her," exclaimed Eric, amazed. "The voice I've been looking for so long. The girl who saved me from shipwreck." Marina tried desperately to get his attention, to make him realize the mistake, but without her voice, her gestures just looked like the expression of a jealous young woman. Grimsby, impressed by the developments, immediately began preparations for a royal wedding. "The wedding will take place tomorrow at sunset on the royal ship," he announced, while Vanessa smiled triumphantly, her necklace glinting subtly in the daylight. Sebastian and Flounder watched in horror from the beach. "We need to do something," exclaimed the little fish, swimming nervously in circles. "That which is fooling everyone." Marina spent the rest of the day following Eric and Vanessa around the castle, her heart breaking every time she saw him smile at the imposter. The pain in her feet seemed insignificant compared to the agony in her chest. When night came, she took refuge in the palace gardens, letting her silent tears fall into the sea. It was then that Scuttle, a seagull who was always in the way but Marina's loyal friend, came flying in. Marina, you won't believe what I've seen." The seagull began to tell how she had witnessed Vanessa in her bedroom, her true sea which form revealed in a mirror as she laughed and plotted her revenge on King Triton. With this revelation, a plan began to form. Sebastian dived into the depths to warn King Triton, while Flounder rounded up all the sea creatures he could find. Scuttle flew in to mobilize his fellow gulls and other seabirds. The morning of the wedding arrived with a surprisingly clear sky. The royal ship was magnificently decorated with flowers and ribbons, and guests from all over the kingdom arrived to celebrate. Marina, dressed in a simple pink dress, watched the preparations with a heavy heart, knowing that at sunset her fate would be sealed. When the ceremony began, Vanessa walked the deck of the ship like a true queen, her white wedding dress trailing behind her. Eric seemed to be in a kind of trance, his eyes glazed over and an empty smile on his face. Suddenly, the sky was filled with dozens of seabirds. Seagulls dived towards Vanessa, tugging at her hair and dress. Dolphins and seals shook the ship, while crabs and starfish climbed up the hull, creating controlled chaos. In the midst of the confusion, Vanessa's necklace broke, releasing Marina's voice in a golden sphere that floated back to its true owner. The moment the voice returned to her throat, Marina began to sing, and Eric finally awoke from the spell. "It was you," he exclaimed, running towards her. "You saved me that night." But before they could get any closer, the sun began to set over the horizon. Vanessa, now revealed as Ursula, let out a terrible laugh that echoed across the sea. "Too late, little princess." Marina felt a sharp pain run through her body as her legs began to transform back into a mermaid's tail. Ursula, regaining her true form, grabbed Marina with her tentacles and dived into the sea, dragging her with her. "Marina," shouted Eric, without hesitating to dive in after them. In the depths, King Triton appeared, his trident glowing menacingly. "Ursula, free my daughter." "Oh, but we have a contract, Triton dear," replied the sea witch, displaying the golden parchment with Marina's signature. Unless what?" asked the king, his voice trembling slightly. "Unless you want to take her place," suggested Ursula, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Her crown for her life. What do you say, your majesty?" Marina tried to protest, but Ursula's tentacles held her firmly in place. Above them, Eric swam desperately, looking for a way to help, while Sebastian and Flounder tried to guide him through the dark waters. King Triton looked at his youngest daughter, seeing in her the same unconditional love that her mother had shown years ago. With a flick of his trident, he pointed to the contract, turning Marina's signature into his own. "No, Dad," cried Marina, but it was too late. A magical whirlwind enveloped King Triton, and within seconds he had transformed into a small sea creature, another of Ursula's many imprisoned souls. the sea witch grabbed the crown and tried it, her power growing exponentially as she laughed maniacally. The kingdom of the sea is finally mine. Marina floated in shock, watching her transformed father, while Eric continued to swim towards her. The darkness of the deep seemed to swallow up all hope, but in his eyes shone a fierce determination. The battle for the kingdom of the sea had only just begun, and Marina knew she would need all her courage and Eric's love to face what lay ahead. Ursula grew in size and power, Triton's trident amplifying her dark magic as she rose from the depths of the ocean. The surface of the sea began to bubble violently, and a storm formed in the sky, with lightning cutting through the dark clouds. Marina, seeing her father transformed into a helpless little sea creature, felt an unknown force grow inside her. Eric, who was still swimming nearby, finally managed to reach her. Their eyes met in the midst of the chaos, and in that moment, they both knew what they needed to do. "The necklace!" shouted Sebastian, swimming frantically around them. The necklace she wore before still has some of the original magic. Marina dived towards the wreckage of the ship where she had first met Eric, with him following close behind. Among the debris, the necklace glowed faintly, still bearing traces of Ursula's original spell. Meanwhile, above them, the sea witch was using her trident to create a gigantic whirlpool, bringing shipwrecks up from the depths. "Poor unfortunate souls," thundered Ursula, her voice echoing across the ocean. "Behold your new queen." Marina reached for the necklace, just as one of the resurfaced ships almost crushed them. Eric, displaying extraordinary courage, swam through the floating wreckage, grabbing a broken spear from one of the figureheads. Marina's sisters emerged from the turbulent waves, bringing with them an army of sea creatures. Even mermaids and tritons from distant kingdoms came to their aid, recognizing the threat Ursula posed to all the oceans. "We need to take the trident from her," shouted Marina to Eric, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Flounder and Sebastian coordinated a diversionary attack, leading schools of fish that swam in formation, confusing the sea witch's vision. The seagulls, led by Scuttle, plunged from the sky like arrows, striking Ursula in the face. Eric, taking advantage of the distraction, swam over to one of the resurfaced ships and began to climb its sloping hull. Marina followed, her tail providing enough momentum to keep up with him. The necklace around her neck began to glow more brightly as they approached Ursula. "Insignificant insects," roared the witch, shooting lightning bolts from her trident in all directions. One of them hit the ship where Eric and Marina were, causing it to tilt dangerously. It was then that Marina realized what she needed to do, concentrating on the love she felt for Eric, for her father, for her family, and for the ocean itself. She began to sing. Her voice, amplified by the residual magic of the necklace, created a harmony that made the waters vibrate. The souls imprisoned by Ursula, including King Triton, began to resonate with Marina's melody. The sea witch felt her power falter, the trident trembling in her hands. Eric, seeing his chance, threw the spear with all his might, hitting Ursula's arm and causing her to drop the trident. Marina dived to catch it, but Ursula was quicker, grabbing her with her tentacles. "Did you really think you could beat me, little princess?" At that crucial moment, Eric leapt from the ship, grabbing the trident before it sank into the depths. With one swift movement, he threw it towards Marina, who managed to free herself from Ursula's tentacles using her tail as leverage. Holding her father's trident, Marina felt its power flow through her. The music in her heart turned into pure energy, and with a cry that mixed pain and determination, she pointed the trident at Ursula. A ray of golden light pierced the sea witch's chest. Ursula began to fall apart, her gigantic body turning into dark foam that dissipated into the waves. With her destruction, all her curses were broken. The imprisoned souls returned to their original forms, including King Triton, who regained his crown and majestic appearance. The storm began to calm down, and the sun broke through the clouds. Marina swam over to Eric, who was floating exhausted on the surface. Her father watched them, finally understanding the depth of the love between them. "Marina, my daughter," said King Triton, his voice gentle, "you have shown more courage and true love than I ever imagined possible." With a flick of his trident, which Marina returned respectfully, he created an arc of golden light that enveloped his youngest daughter. Marina felt a familiar tingle run through her body, but this time there was no pain, just a warm sensation of transformation. "Go ahead, my little one," smiled Triton. "Live your life with the one who won your heart." Marina looked at her legs, human again, and then at Eric, who was smiling with tears in his eyes. They swam together to the beach, where they were greeted by a crowd who had witnessed the epic battle. The wedding was celebrated both on land and at sea. Sea creatures and humans gathered to witness the union that bridged the distance between two worlds. Marina, radiant in her white dress, could see her sisters smiling from the waves, while Sebastian led a choir of fish that sang joyfully. Eric and Marina built their castle by the sea, with a staircase that went straight down to the water, allowing her to visit her family whenever she wished. Over time, they became a bridge between the two worlds, promoting peace and understanding between humans and sea creatures. At night, when the moon shone over the waves, Marina still sang the ancient melodies of her people, her voice carrying stories of love, courage, and sacrifice across the waters. And in every note, in every word, was the reminder that true love has the power to transcend any barrier, even those between land and sea. Winter had set in with unprecedented cruelty in that small village on the edge of the forest. The snow covered the roofs of the wooden houses like a heavy white blanket, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the lament of those struggling to survive. In one of these houses, the most modest of all, lived a family that, like so many others, was facing terribly difficult times. Joao, a 12-year-old boy with curious eyes and brown hair that was always tousled, shared a small room in the attic with his sister Maria, a 10-year-old girl who, despite her young age, already showed wisdom beyond her years. Their days were filled with little adventures around the house, always together, as if they were each other's shadow. The children's father, a lumberjack with calloused hands and a constantly worried expression, spent his days in the forest, trying to make a living from it, which was becoming increasingly scarce. His second wife, a thin woman with a stern look on her face, had joined the family only 2 years ago, after the children's mother died during a particularly cruel winter. Meals, which used to be moments of joy and communion, became silent and tense. The bread, increasingly hard and scarce, was divided into smaller and smaller portions. John and Mary could see the growing despair in the eyes of their father, who could barely look at his children during meals, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. One particularly cold night, when the children should have been asleep, altered voices from downstairs caught their attention. John and Mary, driven by curiosity and fear, quietly descended the attic stairs, taking a seat on the top step where they could hear the conversation without being noticed. "There is no other choice," said the stepmother, her voice a whisper full of determination. "We can't feed 4 mouths. We can barely feed ourselves. If we carry on like this, we'll all starve to death." The father protested weakly, his voice laced with anguish. "They're my children. I can't just... Tomorrow, you'll take them to the deepest part of the forest," she continued, ignoring his protests. "Leave them there. Nature will decide their fate. It's cruel, yes, but it's even crueler to watch them all slowly starve to death." John felt Maria tremble beside him and held her hand tightly. In the darkness of the stairwell, the silent tears of the siblings mingled with the muffled sobs of their father, who finally gave in to the terrible plan. That night, while his sister slept a restless sleep, John stayed awake, his young brain working furiously in search of a solution. The full moon illuminated the room through the small attic window, and it was its glow that gave him an idea. He got up quietly and, picking up a piece of hard bread he had saved from his last meal, began to reduce it to crumbs. The next morning, when their father called them for a walk in the woods, John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. In his pockets, John carried the crumbs that would be his salvation. Maria, who had always been the more observant of the two, memorized every detail of the path, every peculiar tree, every stone that could serve as a reference. The forest swallowed them deeper and deeper. The father, walking ahead, occasionally wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his worn shirt. John discreetly dropped the breadcrumbs, creating a trail that would guide them back home. Maria squeezed her brother's hand tightly, finding courage in each other's presence. After what seemed like an eternity of walking, they reached a small clearing. The father, in a trembling voice, asked the children to wait there while he searched for firewood nearby. "Don't go anywhere," were his last words before disappearing into the trees, leaving his children alone in the cold, green immensity of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. John and Mary stood still, listening to the sounds of the forest intensifying around them. The wind whispered among the leaves, birds sang somewhere far away, and small animals ran across the ground covered in dry leaves. "He's not coming back, is he?" whispered Maria, her voice small and frightened. John hugged his sister, trying to convey a confidence he didn't fully feel. "Don't worry," he said. "I've left a trail of crumbs. When it gets dark, we'll be able to follow you back home." But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, a terrible discovery awaited them. Searching for the start of the trail of crumbs, they found only a few bird feathers and no sign of the path they had marked. The birds of the forest, hungry as all get out in that cruel winter, had devoured their only chance of return. Darkness began to approach, bringing with it an even more intense chill and even more threatening sounds. John and Mary, now truly lost in the forest, clung to each other, seeking warmth and comfort. Fear was beginning to settle in their hearts, but along with it, a fierce determination to survive, to find a way, to stay together against all the odds the forest could throw at them. What they didn't know was that their journey had only just begun, and that the dangers of the forest would only be the first of many challenges they would have to face. In the growing darkness, something was watching them, something that had long been waiting for visitors like them, something that would make their quest for survival even more desperate than they could have imagined. Night was rapidly advancing over the forest, bringing with it ever-lengthening and threatening shadows. John and Mary, still hugging each other to protect themselves from the biting cold, began to look for a safe place to spend the night. The boy, trying to keep his composure for the sake of his little sister, scoured the surroundings in search of some natural shelter. "There," exclaimed Maria, pointing to a large fallen tree whose exposed roots formed a kind of natural hollow. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the icy wind that was starting to blow harder. The brothers settled into the small space, using dry leaves to create an insulating layer between them and the damp ground. Hunger was beginning to set in, painfully reminding them of why they had been abandoned. John searched his pockets, finding just a few crumbs left over from the bread he had used to mark the way. He carefully shared them with Mary, although they were barely enough to full his stomach. "John," whispered Maria, her voice trembling slightly, "do you think there are wolves in this forest?" Before John could answer, a distant howl cut through the night air, making them both shrink even further into their makeshift shelter. The boy hugged his sister tighter, feeling his own heart racing. "Don't worry," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "They don't usually get close to people." The night seemed endless. The sounds of the forest, once just a backdrop to their little daytime adventures, now seemed amplified and threatening. Every rustle of leaves, every twig snapping under the weight of some nocturnal animal, startled the siblings. Maria eventually fell asleep in her brother's arms, exhausted by the day's walk and the emotional stress. John, however, stayed awake, determined to protect his sister. He watched the dancing shadows cast by the moonlight through the trees, trying to distinguish real threats from tricks played on his increasingly fertile imagination. With the first ray of sunshine, the siblings woke up completely chilled and even hungrier. Their stomachs rumbled painfully, reminding them that they hadn't eaten properly for days. Leaving their night shelter, they started walking in no particular direction, hoping to find some sign of civilization or at least something edible. "Look," exclaimed John, pointing to a bush laden with small red berries. Maria, however, grabbed his arm before he could reach them. "Wait," she said firmly. "Remember what Mom taught us? Some berries are poisonous." John stepped back, grateful for his sister's caution. His mother had indeed warned them about the dangers of the forest before she died. They continued walking, now more attentive to their surroundings, looking for signs of the fruits and mushrooms that their mother had taught them were safe to eat. The hours dragged by, and the hunger became harder and harder to bear. The sun was already high in the sky when a sweet, irresistible aroma reached them, making their stomachs growl even louder. It was a smell unlike anything they had ever smelled in the forest. Sweet, inviting, almost magical. "Can you smell it?" asked Maria, her nose moving like that of a small rabbit sniffing the air. John nodded, already moving in the direction of the tantalizing aroma. The siblings began to follow the scent, their tired legs finding new energy in the promise of food. As they advanced, the scent grew stronger, and something began to glow among the trees ahead. Pushing aside some low branches, John and Mary emerged into a small clearing and stood paralyzed at the most extraordinary sight they had ever witnessed. There, as if straight out of a dream, was a house, but it was no ordinary house. It was a building made entirely of sweets. The walls were made of gingerbread, decorated with colored candies and icing. The roof was covered in chocolate tiles, and the windows were made of crystallized sugar that sparkled in the sunlight. A path of different colored stones led to the door, and as they got closer, they realized that they were made of drops and hard candies. "This can't be real," muttered Maria, rubbing her eyes as if she expected the vision to disappear. John approached cautiously and touched one of the walls. His fingers sank lightly into the soft honey bread, and he brought a small piece to his mouth. The taste was more delicious than anything he had ever tasted. "It's real," he exclaimed, already plucking another, larger piece from the wall. "Maria, it's all real food." The hunger that tormented them overcame any vestige of caution. The brothers began to devour pieces of the house, alternating between the gingerbread on the walls and the colorful candies that decorated them. The taste was so wonderful, so beyond their expectations, that for a moment they completely forgot their fear and exhaustion. They were so engrossed in their impromptu feast that they didn't notice when the door to the house opened silently. A figure watched them from the threshold, a strange smile forming on its wrinkled face. It was only when a sweet, melodious voice cut through the air that the children realized they were no longer alone. "Well, well," said the voice, making John and Mary freeze in place, their mouths still full of sweets. "What lovely little visitors I have today." The person at the door was a kind-looking lady, dressed in colorful clothes and an immaculate white apron. Her eyes, however, had a strange glint that made John instinctively take a step in front of his sister. "Poor things, you must be starving," the lady continued, opening the door wider in an inviting gesture. "Why don't you come in? I've got lots more goodies inside, and you look like you could use a nice hot dinner." John and Mary looked at each other, torn between the fear of the unknown and the hunger that had not yet been completely satisfied by the sweets in the house. The lady continued to smile, patiently, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for their decision. What the brothers couldn't know was that, behind that kind smile and the promise of more treats, lurked a danger far greater than anything they had faced so far in the forest. The candy house was just the beginning of an ordeal that would test not only their courage, but also their cunning and, above all, the bond that united them as brothers. The lady stepped forward, and the light coming from inside the house created strange shadows on her wrinkled face. John squeezed Maria's hand, feeling his sister tremble slightly. Hunger, however, spoke louder than fear, and the delicious aroma coming from inside the house was simply irresistible. "Come, come," urged the lady, her voice as sweet as the honey that decorated the walls. "A nice hot soup will do you a lot of good. You're so skinny." With hesitation, the children followed the old woman into the house. The inside was even more impressive than the outside. Candied sugar furniture gleamed under the light of scented candles, and curtains made of caramel threads waved gently. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, covered with a tablecloth that seemed to be woven from cotton candy. Sit down, said the lady, indicating 2 stools next to the table. I'm going to prepare something special for you. As she moved around the kitchen, John and Mary observed every detail of the room. Despite its sweet and welcoming appearance, there was something disturbing in the air. On the walls, John noticed strange marks, as if someone had scratched the sweet surface. Maria, for her part, couldn't take her eyes off a large cage in a corner of the room, partially covered by a dark cloth. The lady soon returned with 2 steaming bowls of soup, the aroma of which made the children's stomachs rumble even more. Eat it all, she said, her eyes shining in a strange way. You need to get your strength back. The children began to eat greedily, but John noticed that his hostess kept her eyes on them, especially on her fingers, as if she were evaluating them. The soup was delicious, but there was a strange taste that he couldn't identify, something that made his tongue tingle slightly. What are your names, dears? Asked the lady, taking a seat at the head of the table. I'm John, and this is my sister Mary, replied the boy, noticing that his voice sounded more slurred than usual. His head was beginning to feel heavy, and the candles seemed to create dancing shapes on the walls. What lovely names, smiled the lady, but her smile now seemed different, more predatory. You could call me Griselda. Maria had already finished her soup, and her eyes were beginning to close against her will. John struggled to stay alert, but his limbs felt heavier and heavier. The last thing he saw before succumbing to sleep was Griselda's smile, turning into something terrible, and her eyes glowing with a green, unearthly light. When John woke up, he found himself inside the large cage he had noticed earlier. His hands and feet were tied with ropes made of licorice, and his head was still spinning from the effects of the potion Griselda had put in his soup. Maria was in a separate cage, still unconscious. Ah, she's finally awake, said Griselda, her voice now completely different from the melodious one that had greeted them. It was harsh and cruel, matching her true appearance, which was now revealed. A witch with long, twisted fingers, a pointed nose and eyes that shone with an ancient malice. What are you going to do to us? Asked John, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear he felt. Oh, my dear, laughed the witch, the sound resembling fingernails scratching a blackboard. You'll be my dinner, of course, but first I need to fatten you up a bit. You're too thin for a good meal. At that moment, Maria began to awaken, her eyes widening in horror as she realized her situation. The witch approached her cage, appraising her with critical eyes. The girl first, decided Griselda. Younger children are always more tender. John felt his blood run cold. No, he shouted, shaking the bars of his cage. Leave my sister alone. The witch only laughed, a horrible sound that made the sweets on the walls shake. Don't worry, little one. Your shift will come soon. But first, let's start feeding your little sister properly. Thus began a terrible period for the siblings. The witch forced Mary to eat huge quantities of sweets and treats, while John was fed only hard breadcrumbs. Her plan was clear. She wanted to fatten Mary up first, keeping John too weak to try anything. But the witch didn't count on the children's cunning. During the evenings, when Griselda retired to her room upstairs, John and Mary whispered to each other, planning their escape. Maria had noticed that the witch had very poor eyesight and relied mainly on her sense of smell and touch to guide her. John, for his part, carefully observed the witch's routine, memorizing every detail of her habits. Every morning, Griselda would check on Maria's progress by asking her to extend a finger through the bars of the cage. The witch poked it, grumbling about how the girl was still too thin. What she didn't know was that Maria, following John's idea, had started extending a small chicken bone they had found on the floor of the cage, deceiving the witch about her true state. The days turned into weeks, and the witch's patience began to wear thin. Maria remained thin despite all the food, and John, although weak from lack of food, kept his mind sharp, observing and planning. The children knew they had to act soon, before Griselda realized the trick or decided she had waited long enough. One particularly dark night, while the witch was snoring in her room, John whispered to his sister, "Tomorrow, Maria. Tomorrow we'll try. Remember the plan?" Maria nodded in the darkness, clutching the chicken bone in her hand. I remember, John, but I'm scared. I'm scared too, John admitted, but it's our only chance. We have to outsmart her. The brothers stayed awake for the rest of the night, their hearts beating fast at the prospect of what was to come. The plan was risky, and if they failed, there certainly wouldn't be a second chance. But as John had said, it was their only hope of survival. As the first rays of sunlight began to enter through the crystallized sugar windows, the brothers heard the witch's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. It was time to put their plan into action and find out if their cunning would be enough to overcome the evil that held them prisoner. The sun had barely risen when Griselda descended the stairs, her heavy footsteps echoing through the candy house. She approached Maria's cage first, as she always did, her eyes emitting that greenish, evil glow. "Good morning, little one," hummed the witch in her fake voice. "Let's see if you're ready for my feast." Maria, trembling slightly, held out the chicken bone through the bars. The witch felt it with her gnarled fingers, frowning in frustration. "Impossible," exclaimed Griselda, her voice filled with rage. "How can you still be so thin with all that food?" It was at this point that John put the first part of the plan into practice. "Maybe," he said, his voice weak but determined, "she needs something more substantial than sweets." The witch turned to him, puzzled. "Go on," she ordered, her eyes shining with renewed interest. "Our mother always said that roast meat was the best way to put on weight quickly," John continued, praying that his voice didn't betray his nervousness, "especially if it's well seasoned and cooked in the oven." A mischievous smile spread across the witch's wrinkled face. "Yes, yes," she murmured, rubbing her hands together. "That makes sense, and I happen to have an excellent oven." Griselda moved quickly through the kitchen, lighting the large stone oven that took up an entire wall. The flames soon began to crackle, casting dancing shadows across the candy house. "I need to check that it's the right temperature," said the witch, more to herself than to the children. "It has to be perfect." John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. It was exactly what they had planned. The witch was so engrossed in her preparations that she didn't notice when John started fiddling with the lock of his cage with a piece of wire he had found a few days earlier. "Come here, little girl," Griselda ordered, opening Maria's cage. "I want you to help me check the oven." Maria hesitated, but knew she needed to keep the witch distracted while John worked on her release. She approached the oven with faltering steps, observing the flames that licked the inside of the stone structure. "I can't see properly if it's hot enough," complained the witch, her poor eyes hampering her assessment. "Get in there and tell me how the flames are." Maria took a step back, feigning fear. "I don't know how to do that," she said, her voice trembling. Griselda snorted with impatience. "You fool! Just go in and look. Like this, look." The witch leaned into the oven, demonstrating what she wanted Maria to do. At that very moment, John finally managed to open his cage. With an agility that surprised even him, considering his weakness, he jumped out and ran silently to his sister. The moment the witch was leaning completely over the oven, John and Mary gathered all their strength and pushed her over. Griselda let out a horrifying scream as she fell into the burning oven. Maria quickly closed the heavy iron door, while John locked the bolt. The witch's screams and imprecations echoed through the candy house, making the gingerbread walls shake. The children hugged each other, their hearts beating wildly, as the sounds diminished until they ceased altogether. "We did it," whispered Maria, still hardly believing it. But there was no time for celebration. John was already rummaging through the house, looking for supplies to take with him on his escape. In the kitchen, they found a cloth bag which they filled with bread and dried fruit. Maria discovered a small chest full of gold coins and jewelry, probably stolen from other victims of the witch. "Should we take it?" she asked hesitantly. John considered for a moment before replying, "Yes. We can use it to help our family and other needy people in the village." As they prepared to leave, something extraordinary began to happen. The candy house began to melt and crumble, as if the witch's death had broken some enchantment that kept it standing. Chocolate dripped down the walls, and the crystallized sugar on the windows dissolved like snow in the sun. "Quick," shouted John, grabbing his sister's hand. "We got to get out of here." The children ran out of the collapsing house, carrying their precious supplies. Behind them, the magical construction had completely melted away, leaving only a giant puddle of melted sweets on the forest floor. The sun was high in the sky now, and for the first time in weeks, John and Mary could feel its rays warming their faces. The forest seemed different, less threatening. It was as if the witch's death had dispelled a dark mist that hung over that part of the forest. "Which way should we go?" asked Maria, looking around. John closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the stories his mother used to tell him about how to find your way around the forest. "Moss always grows on the north side of the trees," he said, "and our village lies to the south of the deep forest." So the brothers began their journey home, stronger and wiser than when they had been abandoned. The weight of the sack of provisions and the treasure chest was barely noticeable, so great was their relief at being free. As they walked, they talked about what they would tell their father and how they could use the witch's gold to help not only their family, but the whole community that was suffering from hunger. The sun was beginning its descent over the horizon when they spotted a familiar puff of smoke rising above the trees. "It's the chimney of the blacksmith's house," exclaimed Maria, recognizing the pattern of the smoke. The brothers' hearts were filled with renewed hope. They were almost home, but they knew that their adventure had changed their lives forever. They were no longer just two frightened children in the forest. They were survivors who had faced evil and won through their cunning and brotherly love. "Dad, Father," Maria's joyful cries cut through the air as she and John ran towards the little wooden house they knew so well. The woodcutter, who was sitting on a tree stump in front of the house with his face buried in his hands, raised his head when he heard the familiar voices of his children. His eyes, red and swollen from crying, widened in disbelief. In an instant, he was on his feet, running towards the children with open arms. The encounter was an explosion of emotions. Tears, hugs, and words of joy and regret. "My children, my dear children," the father sobbed, clutching them to his chest as if he feared they would disappear again. "Forgive me, please forgive me. I should never have—" "It's all right, Dad," John interrupted, his voice soft and understanding. "We know you had no choice." His stepmother, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the door. Her normally stern face showed signs of surprise and, curiously, relief. In the days since abandoning the children, the weight of her decision had begun to eat away at her conscience. "You've come back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But how?" Maria and John looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They decided at that moment that some parts of their story would be better kept secret. After all, who would believe a house made of sweets in an evil witch? "We found help in the forest," replied John diplomatically, adjusting the weight of the bag of provisions on his shoulders. "And we brought something that can help not only our family, but the whole village." Carefully, he opened the sack and showed its contents, first revealing the food they had collected. Then Maria presented the small chest. When she opened it, the glitter of gold and jewels made the adult's eyes widen in amazement. "Mercy!" exclaimed the stepmother, putting her hands to her mouth. "Where did all this come from?" "It's a gift," said Maria firmly, "to help people who are starving." In the weeks that followed, remarkable transformation took place in the small village. The treasure found by the children was used wisely. They bought seeds to plant, animals to raise, and tools to work the land. The father, now freed from the constant worry about immediate survival, was able to devote his time to teaching other families more efficient farming techniques. The stepmother, touched by the generosity of the children she had condemned, changed profoundly. Her heart, previously hardened by bitterness and fear of hunger, began to open. She became a central figure in organizing community efforts, ensuring that no family went without. John and Mary grew up respected in the community, not only for their mysterious good fortune, but above all for the wisdom they showed despite their young age. At night, when the younger children of the village gathered around the fire, they would tell stories, some true, some imagined, about the dangers and wonders of the deep forest. Sometimes, when they were alone, the brothers would talk about their adventure in the candy house. Although the horror of those days never completely left them, they also remembered how that experience had strengthened the bond between them and taught them valuable lessons about courage, cunning, and the importance of trusting each other. "You know, John," Maria said one afternoon, as they watched the sunset from the attic window they still shared, "sometimes I wonder if other lost children found that clearing after the candy house melted." John smiled, taking his sister's hand. "If they did, I hope they only found wild flowers and edible mushrooms. The witch is gone, and with her her evil magic." Time passed, and the story of John and Mary became a legend in the village, whispered from generation to generation. It told of two children who faced adversity with courage and came back not only with gold, but with something much more valuable: the wisdom that true treasure lies in the love between siblings and the strength that comes from facing fears together. The winters were still harsh, but the village was now prepared to face them. The families had learned to work together, share resources, and look after each other. And when the snow covered the roofs and the wind howled through the trees, people gathered in their warm homes, telling stories about two brave children who changed the fate of an entire community. John and Mary grew up keeping the memory of their adventure alive, not as a horror story, but as a reminder that even in the darkest of situations, hope and cunning can light the way back home. The small town of Sarah Das Cruces has always been shrouded in mystery. Situated between imposing mountains and deep valleys, it was the kind of place where ancient stories were passed down from generation to generation, whispered by the fire on cold winter nights. Miguel Santos, a young 28-year-old veterinarian, never gave much thought to these legends until that fateful Friday night. His veterinary practice was on the edge of town, next to the old road that snaked through the forest. Miguel was just finishing organizing his notes on the last patient of the day, an old dog with joint problems, when he heard desperate knocks on the door. It was Dona Helena, a lady who kept sheep on her property nearby. "Dr. Miguel, please, I need help," she exclaimed, panting. "Something is attacking my sheep. I've already lost 3 this week alone, and now there's one seriously injured." Miguel grabbed his emergency bag and followed Dona Helena in his jeep along the dirt road. The sky was clear, and a majestic full moon illuminated the road, casting unsettling shadows between the centuries-old trees. As he drove, he couldn't help but notice how the air seemed thicker that night. At Dona Helena's small farm, they found the injured sheep in the stable. The wounds were unlike anything Miguel had ever seen in his years of work. They weren't the typical marks of attacks by jaguars or other predators in the region. There were deep lacerations, but also what looked like human handprints. "Mrs. Helena, have you noticed anything strange in recent days? Any different animals hanging around the property?" asked Miguel as he treated the animal's wounds. The lady hesitated for a moment, her gaze lost in the darkness beyond the stable window. "Doctor, you must think I'm an old fool, but there's something in the old stories. My grandfather always talked about the nights of the full moon, especially on Fridays." Miguel continued his work in silence, but Dona Helena's words provoked a restlessness that he couldn't explain. It was then that they heard a distant howl, unlike any sound they had ever heard before. It was no ordinary wolf or dog. It was something between the two of them, something that made the hairs on the back of Miguel's neck stand on end. The town was also home to Clara Mendez, a young history teacher who had recently returned after years studying in the capital. She was particularly interested in local legends and had started researching the region's old families. In her search, she discovered that the Silva family, one of the oldest in the city, had a peculiar tradition. Whenever 7 consecutive male children were born, the youngest was baptized with a special name and kept under constant surveillance during the nights of the full moon. Clara didn't know it, but her research would lead her to discover a surprising connection with Miguel. His grandfather, João Santos, had been the 7th son in a family of 7 brothers, all men. Miguel never paid any attention to this detail of his family history, but the coincidences were starting to pile up in a disturbing way. That same evening, as Miguel was returning home after seeing Dona Helena, he felt a strange sensation take over his body. It was as if something inside him wanted to wake up, something primitive and wild. His hands began to shake on the steering wheel, and drops of cold sweat ran down his forehead, despite the chilly night air. "Clara, who lived in a house near the main road, was poring over old parish registers when she heard a crash coming from the street. Looking out of the window, she saw Miguel's Jeep stopped anyway on the roadside, with the driver's door open. There was no sign of him anywhere. The full moon shone with extraordinary intensity, and the wind carried ancient whispers through the trees. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine when she found, among the documents she was studying, an old photograph of the Santos family. On the back, there was a note in shaky handwriting. May God protect the seventh son on the nights of the full moon. The oldest inhabitants of Cerro das Cruzes always knew that there was something different about the nights of the full moon. People avoided going out after dark, locked their houses tightly, and kept their animals safe. But now, with the increasingly frequent attacks and Miguel's mysterious condition, the old legends were beginning to take on new shades of reality. Dona Helena, in her wisdom of years, realized that something bigger was about to happen. She kept a secret that could help her understand the whole situation, but she feared the consequences of revealing what she knew. Her family had been in the area for generations and knew the real reasons behind the curse that plagued certain families in the town. As the night progressed, Miguel found himself lost in the forest, struggling with a transformation he didn't understand, while Clara began to put together the pieces of an ancient puzzle that could change the fate of Cerro das Cruzes forever. The full moon continued its journey across the sky, a silent witness to a story that was only just beginning to unfold. The next morning, Miguel woke up by a stream, his clothes torn and dirty with dirt. Confusing fragments of the night before populated his mind like scattered pieces of a nightmare. His body ached, and there were scratches on his arms that he couldn't explain. He got up groggily, trying to find his way around the familiar landscape of the forest that surrounded Cerro das Cruzes. Clara, who had barely slept, spent the early hours of the morning organizing her findings. The parish records revealed a disturbing pattern. Every 7 generations, a series of mysterious attacks plagued the region, always coinciding with the birth of the 7th child in one of the traditional families. His eyes widened when he realized that the last cycle had occurred exactly at the time of Miguel's birth. On his way home, Miguel met Dona Helena feeding her sheep. The lady watched him with a look that mixed compassion and concern. "Young man," she said softly, "I think it's time you knew some truths about your family." Inside Dona Helena's simple house, as a kettle whirred on the wood-burning stove, she revealed that she had been a close friend of Miguel's grandmother. Maria Santos knew what was coming, she said, pouring tea in old cups. She tried to protect her grandfather Joao from the curse, but some things are beyond our control. Meanwhile, Clara decided to visit the veterinary practice, worried about Miguel's disappearance the night before. She found the place closed and, on asking the neighbors, discovered that no one had seen him since last night. A growing restlessness consumed her, fueled by the revelations of her research. At Dona Helena's house, Miguel listened attentively to how his grandmother had consulted an old healer from the region, looking for a way to break the curse that threatened her son. The healer had told him about a ritual that should be performed during the full moon, but Maria died before she was able to carry it out. Her grandfather Joao managed to control the curse for years, explained Dona Helena, but the price was high. He isolated himself in the mountains, avoiding contact with other people on full moon nights. The curse, however, didn't disappear. It just slept, waiting for the next generation. Clara, following her intuition, went to Dona Helena's house. When she arrived, she found Miguel sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale and haggard. The meeting of the three was no coincidence. The ancient forces that ruled Cerro das Cruzes were weaving their invisible threads, uniting those who needed to be together. The teacher shared her findings, showing the documents she had found. Miguel, still processing the events of the night before, began to accept the truth that his body already knew. The transformations, the attacks on the animals, everything was beginning to make terrible sense. "There's a way to break the curse," said Dona Helena, her voice full of hope. "But we need to act before the next full moon. The ritual your grandmother discovered, Miguel, involves 3 elements. The blood of the cursed, the true name pronounced 3 times by someone with a pure heart, and a sacred object that belonged to the first victim of the curse. Clara, with her historical knowledge, mentioned an ancient silver cross that, according to legend, belonged to the first inhabitant of Cerritos Cruises to be attacked by a werewolf. The relic was kept in the town's parish church, protected for generations by the local priest. As the day progressed, the three of them began to make a plan. They would only have a few weeks until the next full moon to gather everything they needed for the ritual. Time was short, and the forces opposing them were ancient and powerful. Miguel, still struggling with the fragmented memories of the night before, knew he had to act quickly. Each transformation brought him closer to losing his humanity completely. Clara, for her part, felt that her role in history went beyond that of a mere researcher. There was something in her heart that connected her deeply to this mission. Dona Helena warned them about the dangers they would face. The curse has its guardians, she explained. People and creatures who benefit from the power of transformations and will do anything to prevent you from breaking the cycle. As the sun began to set, the three sealed a silent pact. Miguel returned to his office, determined to maintain a semblance of normality for as long as he could. Clara returned to her research, now with an even more urgent purpose, and Dona Helena remained on her property, vigilant, knowing that ancient forces were moving again in Cerritos Cruises. Night fell over the town like a heavy cloak, laden with secrets and promises. In the distant mountains, a lonely howl echoed, reminding everyone that the battle between man and beast had only just begun. Miguel, at home, locked all the doors and windows, praying that he could control whatever was growing inside him until they found a solution. For the next week, Clara dedicated herself intensely to researching the Silver Cross. Her days were divided between classes at the local school and long hours in the municipal library, sifting through documents yellowed by time. The information she found was fragmentary, but little by little a dark story began to emerge. Miguel, on the other hand, kept a seemingly normal routine in his office. Although the signs of the curse were becoming increasingly evident, his senses were heightened in a supernatural way. He could hear distant conversations and smell smells that had previously gone unnoticed. At night, vivid dreams tormented him, filled with images of dark forests and wild hunts. During a particularly hectic afternoon in the office, Miguel received an unexpected visit from Father Thomas, an elderly man who had served in the parish church for decades. The priest watched him with penetrating eyes as he talked about the latest events in the city. "I've noticed changes in you, young man," said the priest in a deep voice. "Your grandmother Maria used to come to church every day, praying for your grandfather John. She knew this day would come." Miguel felt a shiver run down his spine. "Did you know about my family?" "The church keeps many secrets," replied the priest. "The silver cross you're looking for isn't just a relic. It's a symbol of hope and redemption, but it's also dangerous in the wrong hands." Meanwhile, Clara was making a crucial discovery in the archives. The cross wasn't just stored in the church. It was hidden in a secret compartment, protected by ancient Latin words. Even more intriguing, only someone with pure blood could touch it without suffering terrible consequences. At her estate, Dona Helena received strange visitors. People from the city who she hadn't seen for years began to show up, asking questions about Miguel and the Santos family. She noticed furtive glances and whispered conversations, signs that others were also aware of the changes taking place. One evening, while Clara was working late on her research, she heard a knock on her door. It was Miguel, visibly upset. "Something's happening in the city," he said, rushing in. "People who have never been interested in my family are asking questions. And today I felt like I was being followed." Clara shared her discoveries about the cross, and together they realized that they were facing a complex web of secrets and interests. The curse didn't just affect Miguel. There were others in the town who depended on its continuity, either for power or fear. After his meeting with Miguel, Father Thomas performed an evening ritual in the church. He lit old candles and murmured prayers in Latin in front of the altar. He knew that time was running out, not just for Miguel, but for everyone who kept the secrets of Cerritos Cruises. Clara and Miguel decided to visit Dona Helena again, seeking more information about the ritual needed to break the curse. On the way, they noticed shadows moving among the trees, as if they were being watched by invisible eyes. At Dona Helena's house, they found her preparing a special herbal tea. This will help control the transformations, she explained to Miguel. But it's only temporary. We need to act before the curse becomes permanent. The lady then revealed that the ritual was to be carried out in a specific place, an ancient clearing in the forest where, according to legends, the first transformation took place. The site was marked by stones arranged in a circle, covered in mysterious symbols. While they were talking, a distant howl cut through the night, startling everyone. Miguel felt his body react to the call, a primitive energy coursing through his veins. Clara instinctively took his hand, and for a moment he felt the power of the transformation diminish. The touch of someone with a pure heart can calm the beast, observed Dona Helena, looking meaningfully at Clara. Perhaps it's no coincidence that you've returned to Cerradas Cruises just now. The three of them began to plan how to obtain the Silver Cross. Father Thomas could be an ally or an obstacle. It was difficult to determine which side he was really on. Clara suggested a direct approach, arguing that honesty might be their best strategy. However, the forces opposing them were beginning to manifest themselves more openly. Small accidents began to happen. Important documents disappeared from the library. Clara's car suffered a mysterious breakdown, and the animals in Miguel's clinic became increasingly agitated. The crescent moon in the sky reminded everyone that time was precious. Each night that passed brought Miguel a little closer to the point of no return. Clara noticed subtle changes in his behavior. Moments of distraction when his eyes took on a wild gleam. Moments when his voice took on a deeper, huskier tone. Dona Helena, the silent guardian of so many secrets, knew that the crucial moment was approaching. The ancient forces that ruled Cerradas Cruises were awakening, and the delicate balance between the world of men and the realm of shadows was about to be upset. The next morning, Clara decided to confront Father Thomas directly. She found him in the church sacristy, organizing old liturgical books. The priest didn't seem surprised by her visit, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "I know why you're here, my child," he said, carefully closing the book he was holding. "The Silver Cross isn't just a sacred object. It's a burden that our community has carried for generations." Clara explained about her findings and the urgency of Miguel's situation. The priest listened attentively, his wrinkled face revealing a mixture of concern and resignation. "There are others interested in the cross," he revealed. "People who believe that the curse is a source of power, not a curse." As they talked, Miguel was facing his own battle in the office. The symptoms of the transformation were becoming harder to control. Even during the day, his canine patients reacted strangely to his presence. Some cowered in fear, others growled defensively. Dona Helena, realizing the seriousness of the situation, began to prepare the ritual. In her kitchen, she mixed ancient herbs in an iron cauldron that had belonged to her grandmother. The strong, mystical aroma filled the room as she murmured ancient words of protection. In the late afternoon, Clara returned from her meeting with the priest with some disturbing news. There was a secret society in Cerradas Cruises, made up of families who benefited from the curse. They believed that the werewolf's blood contained mystical properties that guaranteed longevity and power. "The priest showed me old records," Clara explained to Miguel and Dona Helena. "These families have manipulated marriages and births for generations, ensuring that there is always a seventh child to carry the curse." Miguel felt a wave of anger run through his body. "So my family, my grandfather, we were all pawns in a sick game?" Dona Helena nodded sadly. "Your grandmother found out the truth and tried to protect you, Miguel. That's why she insisted that your parents move out of town when you were little." Night was beginning to fall when a group of men showed up at Dona Helena's property. Among them was Ricardo Silva, one of the most influential members of the town. His cordial smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "We've come to talk about family matters," said Ricardo, his soft voice carrying a veiled threat. "After all, we all want the best for our community, don't we?" Clara realized that they needed to act quickly. Father Thomas had given her a crucial piece of information. The silver cross would be at its most powerful during the lunar eclipse that would take place in 3 days' time. Coincidentally, on a full moon night, while Ricardo and his men talked to Dona Helena on the balcony, Clara and Miguel slipped out the back of the house. The special herbal tea kept the transformation under control, but Miguel could feel the beast growing inside him, eager to break free. They arrived at the church as the last lights of the day disappeared over the horizon. Father Thomas was waiting for them, holding an ancient iron key. "The secret compartment is under the altar," he explained. "But remember, only someone with a pure heart can touch the cross." Following the priest's instructions, Clara and Miguel went down a narrow staircase into an underground chamber. The air was heavy with the smell of incense and ancient wax. On the back wall, a small niche held the silver cross, which emanated a supernatural glow in the darkness. Clara reached out her hand, trembling slightly, her fingers touching the cold metal. To her relief, nothing terrible happened. The cross seemed to vibrate gently in her hand, as if it recognized her presence. They barely had time to celebrate their achievement. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs, and Ricardo Silva appeared with his men. "Did you really think it would be so easy?" he asked, his voice now stripped of any pretense of cordiality. Father Thomas tried to intervene, but was quickly restrained. Miguel felt the transformation approaching, fueled by danger and anger. Clara clutched the cross to her chest, knowing they couldn't allow it to fall into the wrong hands. "The curse keeps us strong," Ricardo declared. "For centuries, our blood has been purified by the power of the wolves. We will not allow that to end." At that critical moment, Dona Helena appeared at the entrance to the crypt, carrying her cauldron of herbs. With one swift movement, she threw its contents into the air, creating a curtain of aromatic smoke that disoriented the invaders. "Run," she shouted. "Find the sacred clearing before the eclipse." Miguel and Clara took advantage of the confusion to escape, taking the cross with them. They ran through the night, feeling the cold wind on their faces and hearing the angry shouts behind them. The crescent moon watched silently, like an ancient witness to yet another chapter in this never-ending story. The forest welcomed them with its protective darkness, while time ticked inexorably towards the decisive moment. Miguel could feel the wolf's presence growing stronger, and Clara held onto the cross as if her life depended on it, which in a way it did. In the city, the ancient forces of Ceradas cruisers were mobilizing. An ancient battle was about to reach its climax, and everyone's fate depended on a race against time, a silver cross, and the power of true love to overcome the darkness. The forest seemed to take on a life of its own as Miguel and Clara ran towards the sacred clearing. The centuries-old trees cast dancing shadows in the moonlight, and mysterious sounds echoed everywhere. Time was short. The lunar eclipse was fast approaching. Miguel felt his body struggling against the imminent transformation. Every step was a Herculean effort to maintain control. Clara, still firmly holding the silver cross, guided the way based on the ancient descriptions she had found in her studies. "There," exclaimed Clara, pointing to an opening between the trees. The sacred clearing revealed itself before them, a perfect circle of ancient stones, each marked with mysterious symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Behind them, they could hear the voices of Richard and his men approaching. The sound of branches breaking and dry leaves being trampled echoed through the forest. The secret society would not give up its ancestral power easily. Dona Helena suddenly appeared from a side path, carrying a worn leather bag. "Quickly," she ordered, starting to arrange black candles at specific points in the stone circle. The eclipse will begin in minutes. The ritual needed to be executed with precision. The silver cross was placed in the center of the clearing, and Miguel positioned himself next to it. Clara, following Dona Helena's instructions, lit the candles in a specific order, while the old woman scattered herbs in a circular pattern around them. "This is it," said Dona Helena, watching the sky. The moon was slowly beginning to be covered by a dark shadow. "Clara, you need to call Miguel's real name 3 times, but only when the moon is completely eclipsed." Richard and his followers reached the edge of the clearing, but something prevented them from crossing the stone circle. The ancient magic of the place still retained its protective power. "You don't understand what you're doing," shouted Ricardo, his voice filled with fury. "The curse is our heritage." Miguel felt the transformation begin. His bones crackled and his skin burned as if on fire. Clara held his hand tightly, silent tears streaming down her face as she watched him struggle against the change. Father Thomas appeared unexpectedly, limping but determined. "The curse must end," he declared, positioning himself between Ricardo's group and the sacred circle. "For too long we have allowed evil to thrive in the name of power." The moon was almost completely covered now. Miguel fell to his knees, his body convulsing. Clara could see his features beginning to change, his eyes taking on a wild glow. Dona Helena began to chant ancient words, her voice mixing with the wind that was now blowing in circles around them. "Now, Clara," cried Dona Helena as the last bit of the moon disappeared under the shadow of the eclipse. "Say your real name." Clara closed her eyes, her heart beating wildly. "Miguel Joao Santos," she called once, her voice trembling slightly. The candles flickered. "Miguel Joao Santos," she repeated more forcefully. The wind increased, and the old stones began to vibrate. Ricardo and his men tried desperately to break through the invisible barrier that kept them apart. Father Thomas stood firm at his post, muttering prayers in Latin. "Miguel João Santos?" Clara shouted for the third time, her voice filled with love and hope. At the same moment, a ray of silver light cut through the darkness of the eclipse, striking the cross in the center of the circle. Miguel screamed, a sound that began as an animal howl and gradually turned into a human cry. His body glowed with an intense light, and everyone had to look away. When the light subsided, he was lying on the ground, completely human. The silence that followed was broken by screams of pain. Richard and his followers fell to their knees, as if an invisible force was crushing them. Centuries of mystical power obtained through the curse were being drained from their bodies. Clara ran to Miguel, hugging him as he slowly regained consciousness. When his eyes opened, they were free of the wild glow that had inhabited them for the last few weeks. The curse had been broken. Dona Helena smiled, tears of joy in her tired eyes. "Your grandmother can rest in peace now," she said softly. "The cycle has finally been broken." The eclipse began to pass, and the moon gradually reappeared in the night sky. Richard and his men had disappeared into the forest, taking with them only the shadows of their lost power. Father Thomas blessed the stone circle one last time before beginning his journey back to the city. In the days that followed, Sarah Das Cruises underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The old families who had controlled the town through fear and superstition lost their influence. New leaders emerged, bringing with them an era of transparency and renewal. Miguel and Clara remained in the town, helping to build a future where the old legends would only serve as a reminder of a dark time that is now behind us. Dona Helena continued on her property, now using her knowledge to heal and help, no longer to fight ancestral curses. Full moon nights in Sarah Das Cruises became just another natural phenomenon, no longer filled with terror and mystery. The howls that sometimes echoed through the forest were just those of ordinary wolves, and night travelers no longer feared supernatural encounters on the deserted roads. The silver cross was returned to the church, but now as a symbol of redemption and hope, no longer as a relic of dark power. And on clear nights, when the moon shone over the town, Miguel and Clara walked hand in hand through the square, grateful to have found each other and have helped free their community from a curse that had lasted for generations. The story of the werewolf curse of Sarah Das Cruises became one more legend among many others, but with a different ending, one that spoke of love, courage, and the possibility of breaking even the oldest and most powerful curses when the heart is in the right place. In the beginning, there was only the vast ocean plunged into infinite darkness. The black waters stretched as far as the eye could see, and the silence was broken only by the gentle movement of the waves that danced eternally without destination. In this primordial setting, a single being stood out, the raven, a majestic creature with black feathers that reflected what little light there was in the void. This was no ordinary crow. Its eyes shone with ancient wisdom, and its wings carried the power of creation itself. Kokoro, as it was known in ancient languages, had emerged from the shadows themselves, born from a thought of the universe. His solitude was his only companion as he flew over the infinite ocean, observing his own reflection in the dark waters. For eons that could not be measured, Kokoro flew without rest, this curious mind constantly searching for something beyond the monotony of darkness. In her heart, a burning desire for change grew, then inexplicable will to transform that emptiness into something more. It was then, in a moment of deep contemplation, that he realized he was not alone in his journey. From the depths of the ocean, an ancient voice emerged, as old as time itself. It was Namaka, the spirit of the primordial waters, who had long been watching Raven in his solitary flight. His presence was manifested through gentle ripples on the surface of the sea, forming patterns that only Kokoro could interpret. "Why do you fly aimlessly, Shadow Architect?" asked Namaka, his voice echoing across the waters. "What are you looking for in this infinite void?" Kokoro landed on a wave that hung suspended, like a liquid throne created especially for him. "I seek purpose," he replied, his words carrying the weight of 1,000 thoughts. "This world is too vast to remain in the shadows." It was at this moment that Kokoro discovered his true nature. In his wings slept the power to turn dreams into reality. In his beak he carried the ability to shape the shapeless. And in his heart, he held the desire to create something extraordinary. On the endless horizon, Kokoro saw something that no one else could see. 3 small points of light, so distant that they seemed like an illusion. They were the celestial boxes, mystical containers that held the secrets of luminosity. Raven knew, either by instinct or fate, that these objects held the key to transforming that world of darkness. Namaka, sensing Kokoro's thoughts, became restless. "The heavenly boxes are sacred," she warned, her waters shimmering with concern. "They were sealed by the ancients, those who came before us. Disturbing them could bring consequences that even I cannot foresee." But Kokoro had already made up his mind. With a determined flap of his wings, he launched himself towards the heavenly boxes. His journey would not be easy. The shadows themselves seemed to want to keep him away, creating air currents that tried to divert his course. The wind howled with ancient voices, warning of the dangers of his endeavor. As he flew, Kokoro began to understand that it wasn't just the darkness that needed to be transformed. It was the very fabric of reality that was crying out for change. In his flight, he could feel the weight of responsibility on his wings. He was not just a creator, but a guardian of what was to come. The waters beneath him began to churn more strongly, as if the ocean itself was responding to his determination. Namaka, although worried, couldn't help but admire Raven's courage. She knew that this moment would mark the beginning of a new era, for better or worse. As she approached the heavenly boxes, Kokoro could feel the ancient energy emanating from them. Each one pulsed with a different kind of light. One was golden like the brightest sun, another silver like the most delicate moonlight, and the third sparkled with thousands of tiny points of light, like the stars that were yet to be born. The challenge before him was monumental. The boxes were protected by mystical seals, created to resist the passage of time in attempts to tamper with them. But Kokoro was no ordinary being. In his essence, he carried the very force of creation, a gift that even he didn't fully understand. Namaka watched everything with growing apprehension. The waters under her domain moved in increasingly complex patterns, reflecting her restlessness. She knew that the balance of the void was about to be altered forever, and the consequences of this change would be irreversible. With a precise movement, Kokoro reached the first box. His bright eyes studied the intricate patterns that sealed it, trying to understand its secrets. He knew that his every action from that moment on would shape, not only the physical world, but also the fate of all beings yet to come. The first seal began to crack under his touch, releasing a thin beam of golden light that cut through the darkness like a sharp blade. It was only the beginning of a transformation that would change the face of that primordial universe forever. Kokoro, the architect of shadows, was about to take the first step on his journey of creation, a journey that would lead him to shape mountains, bring forests to life, and populate the world with beings of all shapes and sizes. The wind whispered ancient prophecies, and the waters danced with renewed energy. The moment of creation had arrived, and with it, the dawn of a new era was about to awaken in the hands, or rather, the wings, of the most unlikely of creators, a raven who dared to defy the darkness. The beam of golden light that escaped from the first celestial box grew with every moment, like a primordial dawn that had never been witnessed before. Kokoro kept his beak firmly attached to the seal, his black feathers now bathed in the radiant glow emanating from the box. The power contained therein was greater than he had imagined, and for a brief moment, he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of his own daring. Namaka watched in fascination and awe as the waters around him began to reflect that strange new light, creating dancing patterns on their surface that had never existed before. "Are you sure you're ready for the consequences of your actions, Kokoro?" His voice echoed across the waves, carrying both concern and reverence. Raven didn't answer immediately, concentrating on his task. With a precise and determined movement, he finally managed to completely break the first seal. The golden box opened in a spectacle of light and heat, releasing the sun in all its primordial glory. The incandescent sphere rose slowly over the dark horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange for the first time. The heat of the newborn sun warmed Kokoro's wings, and he felt a deep satisfaction at seeing his first act of creation manifest itself so majestically. The waters below began to glow with golden reflections, creating a spectacle never before seen in that primordial world. Without wasting any time, Raven turned his attention to the second box, the one that held the moon. The seal on this one was different, more subtle and delicate, as if it had been woven with silver threads. Kokoro realized that he would need a gentler approach this time. Using the tip of his ward, he began to carefully unravel the mystical patterns that held the box shut. As he worked, he noticed that the sun was beginning to establish its first cycle, moving slowly across the newly formed sky. It was crucial that he release the moon before the first night arrived, to maintain the delicate balance that was beginning to form. "The tides respond to your creation," observed Namaka, his waters moving in new rhythms, attracted by the gravitational pull of the sun. "The world is changing, Kokoro, and there's no turning back." Raven knew she was right. His every action was creating new natural laws, establishing patterns that would last for eternity. With even more determination, he focused on the seal of the second box. Its silver feathers glowed with a light of their own now, as if they were absorbing the essence of the moon that was still trapped there. Finally, the second seal gave way, and the silver box opened with a soft sigh. The moon emerged, a pale, serene sphere that began its ascent into the darkening sky. Its soft light created a perfect contrast with the intense brightness of the sun that was now setting for the first time. Kokoro watched in amazement as his first two creations established a celestial dance, a cosmic ballet that would mark the rhythm of life for all the ages to come. Day and night were born at that moment, bringing with them concepts that hadn't existed before. Time, cycles, change. Only the third box remained, the one containing the stars. This one was different from the others, its surface sparkling with thousands of tiny points of light, as if it could no longer contain the energy it held inside. The seal on this last box was the most complex of the three, an intricate web of energy that seemed to change shape every time Kokoro looked at it. Namaka noticed Raven's hesitation at this latest challenge. "The stars are different," she warned, their waters reflecting the combined brilliance of the sun and moon. "They carry not only light, but also dreams and destinies. They are the weavers of stories yet to come." Kokoro understood that this last release would be the most significant. The stars would not just be points of light in the sky. They would be beacons of hope, guides for travelers, inspiration for the dreamers who would one day inhabit the world he was creating. With a delicacy that contrasted with his imposing form, the raven began to work on the last seal. His wings moved with surgical precision, undoing the mystical knots one by one. The process was slow and required all his concentration, as one false move could result in cosmic chaos. As the seal came undone, tiny points of light began to escape, like little sighs of eternity. Each star that broke free found its place in the vast night sky, gradually forming the constellations that would tell the stories of the universe. Kokoro's work was almost complete, but he knew that this was only the beginning of his journey as a creator. Light had been brought into the world, but there was still much to be done. The infinite waters begged for land. The vast, empty expanses cried out for life, and the primordial silence longed for voices to fill it. The last star found its place in the firmament, completing the great work of illuminating the world. Kokoro hovered for a moment, his wings outstretched, admiring the transformation he had accomplished. The universe now pulsed with a new and vibrant energy, a rhythm that he himself had established. Namaka moved his waters in a pattern that suggested approval. "You have brought light into the world, architect," she said, her voice carrying a new tone of respect. "But the darkness still has its place in its purpose. The balance you have created is perfect." Raven knew she was right. The darkness had not been eliminated, but transformed into something just as precious. The night, with its silver moon and twinkling stars, was just as important as the sunny day. It was in this balance that the true beauty of his creation lay. While resting on a gentle wave, Kokoro was already beginning to plan his next great work. His keen eyes focused on the depths of the ocean, where he knew he would find the necessary elements for his next creation. The mainland was waiting to emerge, and with it, a new chapter in the history of the world was about to begin. With his gaze fixed on the depths of the ocean, Kokoro began his descent into the dark waters. Her wings, still shimmering with the reflection of the celestial lights she had released, cut through the air in precise movements. The world was different now, no longer plunged in perpetual darkness, but in a harmonious cycle of light and shadow. Namaka sensed the approach of the raven, and its waters opened gently, like a silent invitation. "The depths hold ancient secrets," she whispered across the waves. "What do you seek in the bowels of the ocean, creator?" Kokoro dipped her wings into the warm waters, feeling the primal energy that pulsed in the underwater currents. "I seek the substance from which the earth will be born," he replied, his voice reverberating through the waters. "This world needs more than just sky and sea." The raven's dive was deep and determined. As he descended, the waters became denser and colder. The light he had brought to the world barely penetrated these depths, creating a realm of shadows reminiscent of the beginning of time. But now, these shadows were no longer an endless void. They were a mystery to be explored. At the bottom of the ocean, Kokoro found what he was looking for: a dense, dark mass, a mixture of sand, rocks, and minerals that had lain dormant since the beginning of time. With his powerful beak, he began to work this primordial matter, shaping it with the same precision he had used to release the celestial lights. Namaka watched with growing interest as the raven worked. Its waters danced around him, sometimes helping, sometimes testing his resolve with unexpected currents. "The land you seek to create will forever change the face of the world," she commented. "My waters will have to learn new ways." The work was hard, but Kokoro didn't give up. Little by little, he began to push the mass up towards the surface. As it rose, the matter began to transform, hardening and taking shape under the influence of air and light. First a rocky peak emerged, then another and another. The sun, on its first full pass through the sky, witnessed the birth of the first mountains. Their dark slopes rose from the waters like sleeping giants, dripping primordial water back into the ocean. The moon, in its first cycle, bathed the new lands in its silvery light, revealing valleys and plains that formed between the peaks. But Kokoro knew that bare earth wasn't enough. With his wings, he began to spread different types of soil over the basic rock. Here a layer of fertile earth, there a bed of clay, further on a field of sand. Each type of soil had its purpose in the grand plan that was developing in his creative mind. The stars, watching from above, seemed to twinkle with approval as the world below them gained more complexity and texture. Their reflections in Namaka's waters created patterns that inspired Kokoro to continue his creative work. "I see the purpose in your work," said Namaka, his waves now crashing against the new rocky shores. "But I also see that this is only the beginning. The land you raise from my depths is still bare and empty." Raven landed on the highest peak of the first mountain he had created. From this privileged vantage point, he could see his creation stretching out in all directions. The lands that emerged from the waters formed complex patterns: archipelagos, peninsulas, deep valleys, and vast plains. With a flick of his wings, Kokoro began to create rivers and lakes, natural channels where the waters of Namaka could flow and settle over the new land. These waterways would be the veins of the world, bringing life and nutrients to every corner of his creation. "Every drop that flows over your land carries a promise," observed Namaka, feeling its waters divide and find new paths across the newborn continent. "I see the potential for life in every stream and lake you create." Namaka's words touched something deep in Raven's heart. Yes, life, this would be his next great challenge. But before he could take this step, he needed to prepare the ground properly. With meticulous care, he began to work on the texture of the earth, creating different environments that would one day house different forms of life. Using his powers of creation, he shaped caves in the bowels of the mountains, carved fertile valleys between the elevations, and created plains that stretched to the horizon. Each environment had its own personality, its own story to tell. The sun completed another cycle, and the moon once again bathed the new land in its silvery light. The stars continued their eternal dance in the sky, silent witnesses to Raven's tireless work. Every moment, the world took on more detail, more complexity. Kokoro knew that his work with the earth was almost complete, but something was still missing. The rocky surfaces and bare soil cried out for cover, for color, for life. His keen eye could already see the forests that would grow on the mountain slopes, the fields that would flourish on the plains, the algae that would dance in the shallows. With his wings spread, capturing the combined energy of the sun and the moon, the Raven was preparing for his next great work. The creation of plant life would be his next challenge, and he could already feel the creative energy flowing through his feathers. Eager to begin this new phase of his creative journey, Namaka, sensing Kokoro's thoughts, moved his waters in a pattern that suggested expectation. "You have shaped the earth wisely," she said, her waves gently caressing the new shores. "Now it's time to cover it with the green mantle of life." Raven nodded silently, his eyes shining with the reflection of the stars. The stage was set for the next act of creation, and he couldn't wait to start painting his world with the colors of life. With his unwavering determination, Kokoro began his next act of creation. Hovering over the newly formed earth, he could feel the life energy pulsing through his black feathers. The bare soil was eagerly awaiting the touch that would transform it into a verdant paradise. First, Raven focused his attention on the banks where land and water met. With delicate movements of his wings, he scattered the first seeds of life, small algae and mosses that quickly established themselves on the damp rocks. These first life forms were simple, but fundamental to what was to come. "I see you start at the beginning," observed Namaka, his waters gently nurturing the new green creatures. "As always, your wisdom shows in the details." Kokoro continued his methodical work, gradually moving from the banks to the interior. In each different type of soil he had created, he now planted a specific variety of plant life. On the rocky slopes, he planted resistant lichens and small plants that clung to the rocks with fierce determination. As his work progressed, the plants began to evolve and diversify of their own accord, as if they had captured Raven's creative essence. small shoots grew into bushes, which in turn inspired the birth of ever larger trees. The first forests began to appear on the slopes of the mountains, with a mixture of sun, rain, and fertile soil created the perfect conditions for growth. Kokoro watched with satisfaction as different species of trees established themselves, some tall and majestic, others twisted and ancient in their wisdom. Each plant has its own spirit, he murmured, landing briefly on a newly formed branch. Each one tells its own story. On the plains, ravens sowed vast fields of grasses that rippled in the wind like the waters of Namaka. The prairies stretched to the horizon, their colors changing with the passing of the sun and moon. In some places, wildflowers began to sprout spontaneously, adding vibrant spots of color to the landscape. Namaka watched in amazement as her aquatic world was complemented by this explosion of terrestrial life. Her waters now not only reflected the lights in the sky, but also the infinite shades of green that Kokoro had brought into being. In the wettest areas, where fresh water accumulated in swamps and marshes, Corvo created specially adapted plants, tall reeds, sturdy cattails, and delicate aquatic plants that floated on the surface of the calm waters. Each environment had its own signature plant, perfectly adapted to the local conditions. As the plants became established, the first natural cycles began to emerge. Leaves fell and decomposed, further enriching the soil. Seeds were carried by the wind, finding new places to germinate. The earth itself seemed to breathe with this new life. "You've created more than plants," said Namaka, observing the complex systems that were forming. "You've created communities, you've created relationships. You've created a living fabric that connects everything." Raven silently agreed. He could feel the connections forming between the roots in the soil, between the treetops above, between the different species that now shared the space. It was a web of life that was becoming more complex by the moment. In special places, Kokoro created natural sanctuaries of extraordinary beauty. Hidden valleys where rare flowers bloomed in cascades of color. Ancient forests where gigantic trees stood like pillars of heaven. Natural gardens where every plant seemed to have been placed with artistic precision. The work continued tirelessly. In the driest regions, Corvo created resistant plants that knew how to conserve water, peculiarly shaped cacti, thorny shrubs, and small succulents that sparkled like jewels in the desert sun. Each adaptation was a new expression of their creativity. In the higher mountains, where the air was thinner and the cold more intense, he established a specially hardy vegetation, small alpine flowers that burst into vibrant color during the brief growing seasons, and low, twisted trees that survive the strongest winds. As the green blanket spread across the world, Kokoro realized that he was creating more than just plants. He was laying the foundations for all life to come. The forests, prairies, and swamps would be the cradle of the future creatures that would inhabit his world. The stage is almost set, he thought, his black wings reflecting the shades of green that now dominated the landscape. Just one last touch to go before we can welcome the next inhabitants of this world. With that thought, Raven set to work on his next challenge, creating plants that could provide sustenance for the creatures to come. Fruit trees began to appear in sheltered valleys, their tops laden with juicy fruit. Nutritious grains grew in the fields, and energy-rich roots established themselves in the fertile soil. Namaka, ever observant, noticed how each new addition to the plant world seemed to follow a larger plan. "You think of those that come after," she commented, her waters nourishing the roots of the plants that reach their depths. "Every seed you plant carries the potential to sustain many lives." The sun and moon continued their eternal dance across the sky, marking the passage of time as the world below transformed into a living, pulsating garden. The stars twinkled above the treetops, their reflections now multiplied in the dewy leaves and night flowers that opened only under their silvery light. Kokoro knew that his work with the plant kingdom was almost complete, but he also felt that something even greater awaited him. The plants had brought color and life to the world, but there was still a lack of movement, a lack of voices, a lack of creatures who could appreciate and inhabit this paradise he had created. With his wings open to the wind, Raven contemplated his next great challenge, to bring into being the beings that would give life and movement to this green world. It would be his most complex and important creation yet, and he couldn't wait to get started. Kokoro flew over his verdant world, admiring the symphony of life he had created. The forests whispered ancient secrets, the prairies danced with the wind, and the waters of Namaka reflected the celestial ballet of the sun, moon, and stars. But Raven felt that his work was not yet complete. The final breath of life was missing, the creatures that would give voice and movement to this majestic scenery. Landing gently on an old bridge, Kokoro began to gather his creative energy. This time, her work would be more delicate and complex than ever. Creating living beings would require not only form and substance, but also spirit and purpose. The waters yearn for inhabitants, whispered Namaka, his waves gently lapping the verdant shores. I feel the emptiness in the depths that only life can fill. The raven nodded and, with a graceful movement of its wings, began its work in the waters. First came the fish, small and bright, cutting through the waves and silvery shores. Then larger creatures emerged from the depths, playful dolphins, majestic whales, and a myriad of sea creatures that filled Namaka's oceans with movement and purpose. But Kokoro didn't just stop at the waters. Turning his attention to dry land, he began to populate the forests and grasslands. From the smallest insects to the most imposing mammals, each creature was carefully thought out to occupy its specific place in the great fabric of life. Birds were his most special creations. As he himself had wings, he paid extra attention to his winged cousins. Delicate hummingbirds, majestic eagles, wise owls. Each was given a unique gift, a special way to contribute to the harmony of the world. You create not just bodies, but stories, observed Namaka, watching as each creature integrated perfectly into its surroundings. The butterflies danced among the flowers she had seen Kokoro plant, the deer grazed on the prairies he had sown, and the bears found shelter in the caves he had carved. As the creatures multiplied, they began to establish their own relationships and cycles. Predator and prey, pollinator and flower, each being found its role in the great dance of life. The once silent world now pulsed with roars, chants, hums, and calls. Kokoro flew from one habitat to another, adjusting and refining his creation. In the mountains, agile goats and majestic eagles made the heights their home. In the swamps, frogs and herons created a natural orchestra of sounds. In the grasslands, herds of herbivores grazed peacefully under the watchful eye of predators. Each creature carries a spark of your creative essence, said Namaka, observing how life spread and adapted. I see your wisdom in the way each one finds its place. Raven continued his work, now focusing on the smallest details. He created insects to pollinate flowers and aerate the soil, small rodents to spread seeds, and a myriad of microscopic creatures to maintain the balance of ecosystems. The seasons began to influence animal behavior. Some migrated as the weather changed, others hibernated during colder periods, and still others adapted their appearance and behavior to suit the different times of year. You have created more than life, observed Namaka. You have created stories that will unfold for generations. And so was, each creature had its own role in the world's grand narrative. The songbirds heralded the dawn, the wolves howled at the moon that Kokoro had released, and the whales sang ancient melodies in the depths of Namaka. The raven landed again on the highest peak, observing his creation in all its glory. The world was now a vibrant and dynamic place, where each being lived in harmony with the others and their environment. It is done, he finally said, his words echoing through time. The world is complete. Namaka moved his waters in a pattern of agreement. Yes, it is complete but never finished. What you have created will continue to grow, change, and adapt. Each creature carries within it the potential for evolution and transformation. And so, Kokoro, the raven creator, completed his great work. The world that had once been just darkness and water now pulsed with life in all its forms. The celestial lights he had unleashed illuminated a planet rich in diversity and beauty. But even though he had completed his task, Raven knew that his role was not over. Now he would be the guardian, the observer, the one who would watch over the delicate balance he had established. The stars continued their eternal dance in the sky. The sun and moon kept up their perpetual dance, and the waters of Namaka embraced the earth with their ancient wisdom. And in the midst of all this, Kokoro flew, his black wings reflecting the light that he himself had brought to the world, eternal guardian of the creation that had been born from his power and his imagination. The world was complete, but its story had only just begun. Every sunrise would bring new adventures, every moonset would hold new mysteries, and every shining star would bear witness to the infinite stories that were yet to come in the world Raven had created.